Somewhere in the middle of England, in the high green country of the Peak District, there is a long sheet of still grey water lying between the hills, and in a certain kind of summer, the kind that comes only once in a great while, the water goes quietly away. It has been a hot year, one of those slow dry years when the rain forgets to fall for week upon week, and the reservoir sinks lower and lower against its banks, and a pale margin of cracked mud widens all around the edge of the lake until the water pulls back from places it has not left uncovered in a lifetime. And there, out in the middle, where for as long as most people can remember there has only ever been the smooth cold face of the water, something begins to rise. First a low grey line of stones, softened and rounded by all their years beneath the lake. Then the stumps of walls, the corners of little rooms, standing no higher than your knee. Then the broken arch of a bridge, its parapet long gone, its footings still faithfully where the masons set them. Then the faint pale scar of a road, running down out of the drying grass and straight on into the shallow water, going on beneath the surface to somewhere you cannot follow. It is a village. It is a whole village, lying drowned and patient under the still Derbyshire water, and in the great dry summers it rises again out of the mud to remember itself, to be walked upon and wondered at, before the autumn rains come softly back and draw the water over it once more. Nobody is frightened by this. The people come out across the warm cracked bed of the lake in their ordinary shoes, and they crouch by the old stones, and they lay their hands on the walls of houses no one has lived in for the better part of 100 years, and they feel more than anything a kind of tenderness, because this is not a place of horror. This is only a place that was loved and lost and kept. And that is the whole story we are going to tell tonight, slowly and gently, from the very beginning until you are fast asleep. So let us begin the way we always begin. Settle in now. Let yourself grow comfortable. Wherever you are, however you are lying, there is nothing left in the day that needs you. Let the shoulders come down from where they have been holding themselves up around your ears all day long. Let them come down and settle. Let the jaw loosen. Let the hands grow heavy and warm. Let the lamp grow dim, if there is a lamp. Let the room go soft and shadowed and kind around you. Let the bed take your weight. All of it. So that you are not holding yourself up at all any more, but simply being held, the way the valley is held between its hills, the way the water is held in the quiet cup of the land. There is no hurry here. There is nowhere at all that we have to be. My voice will go on, low and even, whether you are following every word or drifting far away between them, and it makes no difference at all which you do. If you fall asleep in the first few minutes, that is a small triumph, and I will be glad for you. If you are still with me at the very end, that is fine too. And if you would like to help this quiet little channel, you might gently like this video or subscribe to it, but only, and I do mean only, if you truly enjoy what I do here. If these long, slow stories of old and faraway places genuinely help to carry you down into sleep, there is no need otherwise, none at all. And if you feel like it before you drift off, you might leave your location and your local time down in the comments below. I always love to read them, to think of you all lying in the dark in so many different towns and countries, in so many different hours of the night, and it truly does help other sleepless people to find their way to this quiet corner of the world, where we simply tell each other old stories until we sleep. Now, because this channel keeps no secrets and springs no surprises, let me tell you plainly, right at the start, the whole shape of the thing, so that your mind can lay down its guard and rest. There is no shock coming. There is no twist waiting in the dark to jolt you awake. This is what happened, told in a single breath, and then we shall go back to the beginning and take it slowly. In a green and quiet valley in the Peak District of Derbyshire, in the North Midlands of England, there once stood two small villages, side by side along the river. One was called Derwent, and the other was called Shopton. Keep those two names gently in your mind, for they are the names we shall follow all the way to the end. They were little places, farming places, old and settled and sure of themselves, with a hall and a church and a mill and an inn and a scattering of stone farms among the hills. And in the 1940s, in the middle of the Second World War, both of those villages were given up, on purpose and forever, to the water. The great growing cities away to the east and the south were thirsty, thirstier every year, and they needed clean upland water more than they needed almost anything else, and so it was decided, lawfully and after long thought, to build a mighty dam across the foot of the valley and let the river back up behind it and fill the whole green bowl of the land with a reservoir. And that is what was done. The villages were emptied, gently and with care. The living people were brought out of their homes and helped to move away, and a whole new little hamlet was built for many of them, just below the dam, so that they should not be scattered to the winds. And the dead, the old dead lying in the churchyard, were lifted, one by one, with reverence and with prayers, and carried away to rest in dry and consecrated ground in a village nearby, so that no one should sleep beneath the cold water. And then the buildings were pulled down, and the river was stopped, and the water rose, slowly and blamelessly, week by week and month by month, up over the fields and the roads and the doorsteps, until the two villages were gone from sight beneath a wide grey lake. And there they lie to this day, remembered and cared for, their story kept safe, their ruins rising up again out of the mud in every great drought, as if to say, we are still here, we have not been forgotten. So you see, there is no villain in this one. That is worth saying, and worth resting on, because so many old stories have a cruel man in them somewhere, and this one does not. Nobody in this story is wicked. Nobody is turned out into the snow by a hard heart. There is only need, the honest need of a great many people far away for clean water to drink. And there is sorrow, the honest sorrow of a few hundred people who loved a place and had to leave it. And there is the slow, patient water, rising in the dark, covering it all over as softly as sleep. It is a sad story, yes, but it is a gentle sadness, the kind you can rest in, the kind that does no harm. And it is all long, long over. Every part of it happened many years ago. There is nothing here to fear, nothing here that is not already finished and quiet and at peace. So you may let go completely. You may drift off at any moment you like. I will keep watch over the story for you. Now let us go all the way back, further back even than the villages themselves, back to a time before there was anyone at all to give the valley a name, so that we can start the whole thing properly, from the ground up, from the very bones of the land. Before the reservoir, before the dam, before the villages, before the church and the hall and the little hump-backed bridge, there was only the country itself, the high wild country of the peak. And it is old country, some of the oldest feeling land in all of England, worn down and settled and calm. Picture it, if you can, though there is no need to try too hard. Let the picture come of its own accord, the way pictures come just before sleep. There are the great rolling moors up on the tops, broad and dark and open, mile upon mile of them, clothed in heather that turns a deep soft purple in the late summer, and a quiet russet brown in the winter. There is the peat beneath the heather, black and wet and deep, holding the rain like a vast, slow sponge, so that even in the driest weather the moor is soft underfoot, and the water is always somewhere near, seeping and gathering and trickling downward. There are the gritstone rocks that break through the heather here and there along the edges of the moor, great weathered blocks and shelves of coarse dark stone, shaped by 10,000 years of wind and frost into rounded, brooding, patient forms. And there is the silence up there, the wide grey windy silence of the high moor, broken only now and then by the long bubbling cry of a curlew wheeling somewhere overhead, or the sharp small call of a grouse among the heather, or the far-off complaint of sheep. It is a lonely place, the tops, and a beautiful one, and it has looked very much the same for longer than there have been people to look at it. In the winter the moor goes white and hard, the peat freezing under a thin crust of snow, the becks stilled to ribbons of ice, the whole high world hushed and waiting. In the spring the cotton grass comes out across the wetter ground, thousands upon thousands of little white nodding heads bobbing in the wind like a soft snow that will not melt, and the lambs cry thin and high on the lower slopes. In the summer the heather hums with bees, and the air smells of warm peat and honey, and the sharp green scent of bracken, and the light lies long and golden across the tops in the slow evenings. And in the autumn it all turns to russet and bronze and fading purple, and the mists come down, and the moor draws back into its own great silence to wait out another year. Round and round, season after season, patient beyond all counting, the high moor keeps its slow calendar and asks nothing of anyone, and gives its clean cold water freely to the valley below, as it has always done, and as, in a manner of speaking, it does to this very day. And out of that high dark moor, out of all that held and gathered water, a river is born. Not born in any single place, but gathered, drop by drop and trickle by trickle, from 1,000 tiny springs and seepings and peaty little runnels all across the tops, until the runnels join into becks, and the becks join into streams, and the streams come tumbling and chattering down off the high ground into the head of a long green valley, and there they gather themselves at last into a proper river, clear and cold and quick. This is the River Derwent, and we shall say its name softly and often, for it is the true hero of this story, patient and unhurried and old, the Derwent, coming down off the moor, running the whole length of the valley, cutting down through the gritstone over long ages into a deep and winding trough between the hills. And as it comes down out of the wildness of the tops, the land around it softens and gentles. The moor gives way to the valley sides, and the valley sides lower down give way to green pasture and meadow along the river, sheltered and mild, where the grass grows thick and the trees can stand, oak and ash and rowan and alder, leaning over the water. It is a hidden, cradled, kindly sort of place, the floor of the valley, tucked away below the harshness of the moor, warm in the summer and sheltered in the winter, with good grass and clean water and standing timber and shelter from the wind. In other words, it is exactly the sort of place where people in the slow fullness of time would choose to come and live. And come they did, though very slowly and very long ago. For a very great while, longer than any records reach, this was a country of walkers and drovers and pack animals, a country crossed by narrow old ways that wound their patient course over the moors and through the valleys, linking the villages of one dale to the villages of the next. These were the pack-horse ways, the ancient tracks worn deep into the hillsides by the passing, year upon year, century upon century, of long trains of laden ponies. For in that hilly country, before there were good roads, before there were carts that could manage the steep and stony ground, almost everything that had to be carried from one place to another was carried on the backs of sturdy little pack-horses, roped together nose to tail in long patient strings, plodding over the tops in all weathers. Salt came that way, and wool, and lead from the mines, and cloth and malt and lime, and all the 100 goods of an old rural country. And the men who led those trains, who bought and sold and drove the goods across the hills, were called by an old word, jaggers, the pack-horse men, weathered and slow-spoken, and knowing every stone of every track for 40 miles around. It was a slow trade, and a hard one, and an honest one. A pack-horse walks at the pace of a walking man, no faster, and so the goods of that old country moved across it at the pace of a walking man, mile after unhurried mile, over the tops in the wind and the rain and the thin winter sun, down into one green valley and up out of it, and over the next brown moor, and down into the valley beyond. There was no hurrying it. There was no shortening it. A journey took as long as it took, and the jaggers and their ponies simply leaned into it and went, and rested where night found them, at some lonely wayside inn or some farm that would take them in, and rose in the grey dawn and went on. It is a restful thing to think about, that slow old world, where nothing could go faster than a horse could walk, and everybody knew it, and nobody expected otherwise, and it left its marks upon the land, gentle marks, kindly marks, the the sunken green lanes, the worn guide stones set up at the lonely crossings of the moor with their carved pointing hands, and the little bridges. You can still find their ways today, running green and sunken across the moors, and here and there you can still find the narrow little bridges they built to carry their ponies over the rivers, humpbacked and steep and just wide enough for a single laden horse, with low parapets so as not to catch against the packs. And one such bridge, a narrow, ancient, beautiful little pack-horse bridge, once stood over the Derwent down in the valley floor, at the heart of the story we are telling. Hold that bridge in your mind, gently, as you drift. We shall come back to it more than once before the night is done, for it is one of the few things in this whole tale that was not, in the end, lost. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is all the time in the world. Let us stay a little longer in the deep past, in the slow settling of people into this quiet valley. As the centuries turned, the drovers' country became, little by little, a settled country. Where there had been only tracks and grazing, there came farms, and where there were farms, there came, in time, a manor and a hall and the beginnings of a village. The valley of the Derwent had its lords, as all such places did, and the manor of Derwent passed down through the long generations in the way such things do, through inheritance and marriage and the slow turning of the years. And in the 17th century, the manor came into the hands of a family called Balgi, an old Derbyshire name. A family of the middling gentry who held the land and farmed it and lived upon it, and in the year 1672, or thereabouts, built themselves a fine new stone house down in the sheltered valley floor beside the river. This was Derwent Hall. Picture it as a solid, handsome, unpretentious house of that age, built low and strong of the local gritstone, weathered to a soft silvery grey, with tall stone mullioned windows and great chimney stacks and steep roofs. A Jacobean manor house of the old English kind, growing straight up out of the ground it was made from, as though it had always been there and always would be. Around it there would have been gardens and orchards and outbuildings, a walled kitchen garden, stables and a coach house, and beyond them the home farm and the meadows running down to the Derwent. It was not a grand palace, it was a country gentleman's house, dignified and comfortable and rooted, the kind of house where the same family lives for generations, where the panelling darkens with age and the flagstones wear smooth in the doorways, and every room has its own long memory. There would have been great fireplaces in it, wide enough to sit inside on a winter's night, and the smell of wood smoke would have soaked into the stone over the centuries until it became a part of the house itself. There would have been a long oak table worn pale with scrubbing, and heavy doors on iron hinges that groaned in their own particular voices, and narrow stairs that turned in the thickness of the walls, and small deep windows that let in squares of pale moorland light to move slowly across the floors as the day turned. Outside, the doves would have murmured in the dovecote, and the rooks would have quarrelled in the tall trees, and the beck would have chattered past the garden wall. And in the evenings the lamps would have been lit one by one in the low rooms, small warm points of gold in the great blue dusk of the valley. Derwent Hall would stand in that valley for the better part of 300 years, passing in time out of the hands of the Balgais and into the hands of greater men, coming at last to belong to the Duke of Norfolk himself, the premier duke of all England, and in its very last years its grand rooms would echo to the boots and laughter of young hikers. For it ended its long life humbly and happily as a youth hostel, a place where walkers of the moors could find a bed and a fire. But all of that lay far ahead. In the beginning it was simply the hall, the great house of the little valley, the place around which everything else slowly gathered. For that is how villages grew, in that old world. Around the hall and the farms there came, over the patient years, the other things that a community needs. A mill was built beside the river, a corn mill, where the falling water of the Derwent was harnessed to turn a great wheel and grind the valley's grain into flour, its low rumble and splash becoming one of the settled everyday sounds of the place. Cottages rose here and there along the lanes, small and low and strong, housing the farm hands and the mill hands and the craftsmen. Barns and byres and little stone field shelters spread out across the hillsides, and in time as we shall see when we come to it properly, a church was raised for the souls of the parish, and a school for its children, so that the little settlement of Derwent, gathered along the valley floor about its hall and its mill and its narrow packhorse bridge, became a true village, small and complete and sufficient unto itself, a place where you could be born and christened and schooled and married and buried without ever much needing to leave the valley at all. The lanes of Derwent were narrow and green, and edged with dry stone walls built without a scrap of mortar, only the patient fitting of stone upon stone by the hands of men long dead, walls that ran up over the hillsides in long grey lines and folded the land into its fields, and had done for hundreds of years, and looked as though they would do for hundreds more. There were sheep in the fields, the hardy little sheep of the hills, and there were cattle in the water meadows, and there was the constant soft business of a farming place, the clink of a bucket, the bark of a dog, the creak of a cart, the far cry of a shepherd, the smell of wood smoke and byres and cut hay, and the clean cold breath of the river. It was not a rich place, nor a famous one, nor a place that anything in particular ever happened in. It was simply a home, a small and complete and self-sufficient home, tucked into its fold of the hills and minding its own quiet business, generation after generation. And a little way down the river, lower in the valley, where the land opened out and the ways from the wider world came down over the hills and crossed the water, there gathered a second and smaller settlement. This was a Shopton, and it grew up not so much around a hall as around a crossing. For here, at the meeting of the Derwent's valley with the side valley of the little river Aesop coming down from the west, the roads converged and the river had to be crossed, and where roads cross a river, there people gather. In later years a fine turnpike road would come this way, the great highway over the high wild pass that men called the Snake, carrying its traffic between the busy towns on either side of the Pennine Hills, and where that road came down and crossed the Derwent on its bridge, there a Shopton settled itself, a little roadside village of a rather different character to quiet farming Derwent. A Shopton was a place of coming and going, of travellers and carriers and drovers pausing on their way through, and so it had in time its inn to give them rest, the Shopton Inn, and its chapel and its shop, and its blacksmith's forge ringing away beside the road, and its cluster of cottages along the way. Two little villages, then, sisters in the same green valley, Derwent above, gathered quiet and old about its hall and its church, a Shopton below, busier and more worldly, gathered about its bridge and its road and its inn. Together they never held more than a few hundred souls, all told. You could have walked from one to the other in less than an hour along the riverside, and the people of the one knew the people of the other, and they shared the same weather, and the same river, and the same wide encircling hills, and the same deep-rooted, unquestioned certainty that this was how things were, and how things had always been, and how things would always be. That is the feeling I want to leave you with tonight, as you drift down towards sleep, the great settled permanence of it all. For that is the tenderest thing about this whole story, and the thing that lets it rest so gently on the heart. Nobody in that valley, in those long, quiet years, had the least idea that any of it would ever end. Why should they? The hills had stood forever, the river had run forever, the hall had stood for hundreds of years already, growing only more solid and more venerable with age. The packhorse bridge had carried its ponies for longer than anyone could say. The church held the bones of grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers, generation upon generation, lying at rest in the same small churchyard, in the same small parish, under the same encircling hills. Everything about the place spoke of continuance, of things handed down and kept and passed on, of a slow deep permanence as sure as the moor and the peat and the stone. The seasons came round, and came round again. The sheep were driven up to the high pastures in the spring, and gathered down again in the autumn. The mill turned, the bells rang, children were born, and grew old, and were buried where their fathers were buried, and their children took their places, and nothing seemed ever really to change at all, but only to turn, slowly and surely, like the great wheel of the mill, round and round in the same patient course, forever. And it was all, of course, about to change utterly. But that is a story for another chapter, and there is no need to think of it now. For now, there is only the old valley in its long afternoon of peace, the moor above and the river below, the heather and the peat and the curlew's cry, the grey hall among its orchards, the mill turning by the water, the narrow bridge over the Derwent, the two little villages settled quiet and sure between their hills, dreaming their long unbroken dream that everything would go on forever, exactly as it always had. Rest there a while. Let the valley hold you as it held them. And when you are ready, if you are still awake at all, we shall go down together into the living villages themselves, and walk their lanes, and stand in their doorways, and come to love them, gently, in the slow warm light of an afternoon that does not yet know it is drawing toward its evening. But there is no hurry. Sleep now, if you would like to. The valley is quiet, and the water is far away, and everything is at peace. So let us walk down into the valley now, in the years of its long and settled bloom, somewhere between the beginning of the 1700s and the closing of the 1880s, when the two little villages of Derwent and Ashopton lay in the green lap of the moors and believed, as small places do, that they would lie there forever. There is no hurry tonight. The valley is not going anywhere for a good long while yet, and neither are you. Let the morning come up slowly over the eastern ridge, the way it did on 10,000 ordinary mornings, the light sliding down the heather and the bracken, and finding at last the pale ribbon of the river Derwent as it came murmuring down the floor of the dale. The river was the oldest inhabitant of that place, and the least concerned with the doings of people. It had come down off the high peat for longer than there had been anyone to watch it, and it went on coming down, cold and clear and brown as weak tea where it ran over the stones, gathering the little becks and sykes and springs of the moor into itself as it went, patient and unbothered, on its slow way toward the far-off sea. Along its banks the alders leaned, and the willows, and in the wet meadows the kingcups burned yellow in the spring, and the meadow-sweet frothed white in the summer, and the whole green length of it lay cupped between the dark shoulders of the Gritstone hills, as neatly as an egg lies in a nest. Up on the tops the world was all wind and space and the crying of the curlews, but down here, along the water, it was sheltered and soft and kind, and that is where the people had gathered, as people always gather, in the sheltered and the soft and the kind places, close to the running water and out of the worst of the weather. Up the main valley, where the dale was broadest and the pasture richest, lay the village of Derwent, sometimes called Derwent Woodlands, which was the grander and the older of the two, and thought rather well of itself, in the quiet way that a village of perhaps a few dozen souls can think rather well of itself without anyone from outside ever quite noticing. It was not a village of streets. It had never been tidy enough for streets. It was a loose and comfortable scatter of stone farms and cottages strung along the lane and up the side cloughs, each with its own huddle of barns and byres and its own square of walled garden, its gooseberry bushes and its beehives, and its line of washing, and its own particular opinion about the weather. The houses were built low and thick out of the same dark gritstone the hills were made of, so that they looked less as if they had been set down upon the land than as if they had grown up out of it, like outcrops that had learned, over the centuries, to hold a fire and a family. Their roofs were heavy grey stone slate, greened and goldened with moss and lichen, and their little deep-set windows watched the lane with the mild, unsurprised patience of houses that have seen a great many seasons and expect to see a great many more. At the heart of the village stood the church of the parish of Derwent Woodlands, which had been built in its plain and honest form about the year 1757. A modest chapel of ease made grander by love and habit into the true centre of the place. It was not a great cathedral. It made no pretence of being a great cathedral. It was a square, sturdy, four-cornered gritstone tower with a short spire set upon it, and a low nave behind, and it stood among its yew trees with the settled air of something that had decided, long ago. exactly what it was, and had never once been tempted to be anything else. On a still Sunday you could hear its single bell a mile up the dale, a small brown sound going out over the fields and folding into the noise of the river, calling the farms to come down out of their high fields and be for an hour one gathered people under one low roof. Around the church lay the churchyard, and this we must look at gently and remember, for it matters later. The churchyard was a green and tilted place, softened with long grass, its headstones leaning this way, and that as headstones will, some of them so old and so patiently gnawed by the moorland weather that their names had gone back into the stone, and could no longer be read at all, only felt, faintly, under a wandering thumb. Here lay the village dead, the long generations of them, the Derwent farmers and their wives and their many children, the ones who had lived to be old and bent and full of stories, and the ones who had gone into the ground far too small and far too soon. All of them lying now in the same quiet ground within sound of the same river they had known all their lives, keeping the church company through the long nights and the long snows. It was, everyone agreed, a very good place to be buried, if a person had to be buried anywhere, which on the whole a person does. Just up the lane from the church stood the hall, Derwent Hall, the manor house we watched being raised in the last chapter, the tall gabled Jacobean house of dark stone that the Balgi family had built about the year 1672 and that had passed, in the slow way of these things, down the generations and at last into the great and distant ownership of the Duke of Norfolk. By the years we are speaking of, the hall had grown old and dignified and a little worn at the edges, as the best old houses do, its mullioned windows glinting under their stone hoods, its gardens gone half to seed, and all the lovelier for it, its many chimneys sending up their thin blue threads of wood smoke into the morning air. In its very last years, long after our present chapter, it would end its days humbly and rather sweetly as a youth hostel, full of the boots and rucksacks and cheerful clatter of young walkers come to tramp the moors, which is a kinder fate than many a great house meets, and one the old walls seemed not to mind. But now, in its settled prime, it was simply the hall, the big house of the valley, and the smoke from its chimneys and the smoke from the meanest cottage went up side by side into the same sky, and were, from any little distance, entirely impossible to tell apart, which is a thing worth remembering about smoke, and about most other matters too. Down at the river turned the mill. Every proper village had its mill, and Derwent had a good one, a corn mill set close against the Derwent, so that the river might be persuaded to do a share of the village's work, which the river did with its usual air of not having particularly noticed. The great wheel turned, dripping and creaking and flinging its little rainbows, and inside, in the flowery dusk, the millstones went round and round with their low grinding song, and the whole building trembled very slightly all day long as if it were purring, and the miller went about white to the eyebrows, and was, by the ancient and unbreakable law of villagers, universally suspected of keeping just a little more of everyone's flour than he was strictly entitled to. Whether he did or not, history does not record, and it does not much matter now, for the mill and the miller and the suspicion and the flour are all under the water together, and the water keeps no accounts. And crossing the river, close by the mill, there stood the loveliest small thing in all the valley, the pack-horse bridge. It was a narrow, humped, medieval bridge of grey stone, old past all remembering, thrown across the Derwent in a single graceful stride for the pack-horse trains to cross dry shod on their way over the moors. It was so narrow that two people could not easily pass upon it, and so beautifully made that no one, in all its long centuries, had ever needed to make it again. Its parapets were low, worn smooth and round by the rub of 1,000 hands and the scrape of 1,000 laden panniers, and the water went under its single arch with a deep, cool, chuckling sound, and generations of village children had lain on their stomachs upon it to watch the trout hang steady in the shadow of the arch. And generations of village lovers had leaned upon it in the dusk, and thrown small pebbles into the dark water for no reason at all, except that it is a very good thing to do. Hold that bridge in your mind as you drift, that patient little hump-backed bridge over the brown water, For of all the drowned things of the valley it is the one that was loved best, and it is the one, as we shall see far off at the end of our story, that was saved. Above and around the village climbed the farms, the scattered hill farms of the high fields, each one alone at the end of its own long stony track, each one with its dogs and its geese and its few hardy sheep, each one wringing its patient living out of the thin acid moorland soil and the short northern summers. This was sheep country before it was anything else and after it was everything else, and the year in Derwent turned upon the year of the sheep. The lambing in the cold bright teeth of the spring, the long green idle wait of the summer, the gathering off the tops in the autumn when the whole valley rang with the calling of dogs and the bleating of the flocks coming down, and, best of all, the sheep washing at midsummer, when the men would dam a pool in the river and drive the sheep through it to clean the wool before the shearing, and the animals would come up the far bank streaming and indignant and suddenly half their proper size, and the whole thing would end, as such things do, with rather more of the men in the river than had strictly been part of the plan. Over it all lay the good plain smells of that life, the blue smell of wood smoke on a cold morning, the warm animal smell of the byres, the sharp clean smell of cut hay lying in the meadows to dry, the smell of bread and of bacon and of wet dog and of peat, the smell, in short, of people living close to the ground and close to the beasts and close to the weather, in the way that nearly all people everywhere lived for nearly all of time, and thought nothing of, and would have been astonished to hear called beautiful, and which we, looking back down the long tunnel of the years, can see now was very beautiful indeed. Lower down the dale, where the main valley met the side valley of the little river Ashop coming in from the west out of the woodlands, stood the other village, Ashopton. And Ashopton was a different sort of place with a different sort of character, as the younger sibling in any family always is. Derwent was the quiet one, tucked up its own valley, keeping itself to itself, but Ashopton stood at the crossing of the ways, and the crossing of the ways makes a village worldly. For here the turnpike road came through, the road that ran clear across the high wild spine of England from Sheffield in the east over to Glossop and Manchester in the west. The road they called the Snake, partly for the great writhing bends by which it climbed the pass, and partly, some said, for the sign of the old inn along it. And this road came down off the moor and crossed the river at Ashopton on a good stone bridge, and where a busy road crosses a river, there a village learns to keep an inn. And keep an inn Ashopton did. The Ashopton Inn stood foursquare and welcoming beside the road, and through its doors, year upon year, came all the moving life of the moors, the carriers with their slow wagons, the drovers bringing their cattle and their geese down off the tops to the town markets, the packmen with their bundles, the farmers in for the fair, the occasional grand and rattling coach with its steaming horses and its passengers, glad past words to see a lit window after the long dark crossing of the pass. The inn had its stables and its mounting block, and its yard loud with hoofs, and its warm low rooms full of tobacco and firelight, and the slow talk of men who had come a long way, and were in no hurry to go the rest of it, and it was, for a great many travellers over a great many years, simply the best sight in the world, the place at the bottom of the terrible hill, where there was a fire and a bed and something hot, and no traveller ever forgets such a place. Near the inn stood the other small furniture of a crossroads village, the Methodist chapel, plain and whitewashed and earnest, filling on a Sunday evening with the strong unaccompanied singing of the moorland faithful, a sound to raise the hair on your neck and gone now these many years, and the village shop, which sold everything a person could conceivably need, and several things no person could conceivably need, and served as the true parliament and newspaper of the district, and the smithy, where the blacksmith stood in his leather apron in the red glow of the forge, shoeing the endless horses of the endless road, and the ring of his hammer on the anvil came out across the valley all day, a bright, hard, cheerful sound. The very sound of a place that is busy and well and going to go on forever. And through Ashopton, all the long day and much of the night, the moving world came and went. The drovers came through in the autumn with their herds, the slow black cattle and the grey geese, whose feet had been walked through tar and grit to shoe them for the road. filling the lane with dust and lowing and the patient tap of 100 hooves, bound for the great markets of the towns below. The carriers came through with their broad-wheeled wagons piled high under their canvas, carrying wool down and salt and sugar and bright cloth back up, and every carrier knew every farm, and every farm knew every carrier, and a message given at one end of the valley in the morning would be safely delivered at the other end by night, which is a faster and a surer post than we sometimes manage now, with all our wires. The pack-horse trains came through, the long strings of sturdy little Galloway ponies with their creaking panniers, threading up out of the dale and away over the tops by the old green ways that had carried the trade of the moors since before anyone could remember, and the jingle of their harness bells came down the wind long before they came into sight and hung in the air long after they had gone. And the ordinary daily life of the crossroads went on beneath all this coming and going, the women at the shop with their baskets, the children dawdling to the school, the old men on the bench by the inn door watching the road with the deep and tireless attention that old men have always given to the doings of other people, missing nothing, judging everything, and enjoying themselves enormously. It was a small world and a whole world, complete in itself, wanting nothing from beyond the hills that the road could not bring it, and it kept its own time and its own weather and its own long memory, and it asked no more of the future than that the future should be exactly like the past, which, for a very long time, and to the great contentment of everybody, is precisely what the future obligingly was. So there they were, the two of them, the two little villages in the green cup of the hills, Derwent quiet up its dale, and a Shopton busy at its crossing, and between them and around them the farms and the fields and the sheep and the river, and over them the wide moorland sky with its curlews and its weather, and through them the slow deep certain rhythm of a whole century and more of ordinary human life. The seasons came round and came round again. The lambs were born and the hay was cut, and the sheep were washed, and the corn was ground, and the leaves went off the alders, and the snow came down and blocked the pass, and lay blue in the shadows of the dry stone walls. And then the snow went, and the kingcups came again, round and round, year upon year, gentle and unremarkable and unbroken. In the little church at Derwent the couples were married, standing shy and scrubbed before the plain altar, and the babies were christened at the cold stone font, and the old folk were carried at last up the tilted green churchyard to lie down among their own. And the same families held the same farms for so many generations that a man's name and his valley's name grew to mean very nearly the same thing. And the deep-rooted, unspoken belief of every soul in that valley, the belief they never once put into words because it never once occurred to them that it might not be true, was that it would always be so, that the church would always call across the fields, that the mill would always turn, and the miller would always be a rogue, that the fire would always be lit in the Shopton Inn, and the hammer would always ring in the smithy, and the little humped bridge would always carry the pack-horses over the brown untroubled water. That the valley was, in a word, permanent as the hills that held it, and that their children's children's children would lie in that green churchyard within sound of that same river until the last trump sounded and the moors themselves rolled up like a scroll. It is one of the mercies given to nearly all people in nearly all times that they do not know what is coming. The good folk of Derwent and Shopton went about their long, slow, ordinary lives, and washed their sheep, and buried their dead, and leaned upon their bridge in the summer dusk, and never once looked up and saw, in the far blue distance, beyond the edge of their world, the thing that was already, slowly and without any malice at all, coming for them. For it was coming. And here, as the valley lies most peaceful, as the smoke goes up straight from the cottage chimneys into the still evening and the last light gilds the top of the little church spire, we must turn our eyes, very gently, away from the sheltered dale and out toward the far horizon, and speak of the thing that was gathering there. Far away, over the eastern moors, beyond the rim of everything the valley knew, the great cities were growing. Down in the smoky lowlands, where the rivers ran black with dye and the sky hung red at night over the furnaces, the towns of the industrial age were swelling into cities, and the cities were swelling into something the world had never seen before. month upon month, street upon street, chimney upon chimney. Sheffield was growing, forging its steel and its knives and its fame. Derby was growing, and Nottingham and Leicester, all of them thickening with mills and works and warehouses, and, above all, with people, hundreds of thousands and then millions of people, packed close in their long brick terraces. And every single one of those people, every man and woman and child of all those uncountable multitudes, wanted, needed, must have the one plain thing that a great city can never make enough of for itself, and that is clean water. A city is, among all the other things it is, a vast and unsleeping thirst. It drinks and cannot stop drinking, for its people and its beasts and its boilers and its washing and its putting out of fires, and the bigger it grows the more it drinks, and the more it drinks the further it must reach for something clean to drink. For its own rivers, poor things, it has long since fouled past all use. And so the men of the growing cities, the aldermen and the engineers, looking about them for pure water in great quantity, lifted their eyes, as men in need will, to the high hills, to the empty upland country, where the rain comes down clean off the Atlantic onto the peat, and gathers itself into cold clear streams, and their gaze, travelling over the map, came at last to rest upon a certain green and sheltered dale in the Peak District, high up among the Gritstone moors, where a clean cold river came down off the tops through a quiet valley of farms, gathering the pure water of a wide catchment into itself as it went. It was, the engineers agreed, looking at their maps and their rainfall tables, very nearly perfect. High, to give the water a good fall. Wide in its gathering grounds, to catch a great deal of rain. Narrow in one or two good places, where a dam might be thrown across to hold the water back. And clean, above all clean, the water of a country of sheep, and heather and peat. Exactly the sweet upland water the parched cities dreamed of, that the valley was also green, and inhabited and beloved, and full of farms and families, and a church and an inn, and a little medieval bridge, and a tilted green churchyard packed with the sleeping dead of 200 years, was a thing the maps did not show, and the rainfall tables did not measure. It is the oldest and the saddest of the quiet ironies, and we will hold it very softly tonight, that the very things which made the valley lovely were the very things that doomed it. Because it was high and clean and full of pure water, the cities wanted it. Because it was wide and sheltered and easily dammed, the engineers could take it. Its peace was its death warrant. Its purity was the price upon its head. And there was, and this is the heart of it, and the reason there is no villain to hate tonight, and you may let your jaw unclench, no cruelty in any of it at all. No wicked lord came to drive the people out for his own gain. No greed, no spite, no malice moved the thing forward. It was only need, plain honest human need, the need of millions of thirsty souls in the hot brick streets for the clean water without which no city can live. And against that great and simple and blameless need, the peace of one small valley, however dear, however old, however beloved, weighed in the end very little, as one candle weighs little against the coming of the dawn. And so it was that in the year 1899, while the good folk of Derwent were still washing their sheep in the river, and the fire was still burning in the Ashopton Inn, and the little bell was still calling across the fields exactly as it had called for 140 years, far away in the offices of the cities, and at last in the high-panelled chamber of Parliament itself, men who had never walked the valley and never leaned upon its bridge set their hands to a great act of law, and by that act there was brought into being a thing called the Derwent Valley Water Board, and its whole purpose, written plain in the language of the statute, was to dam the river Derwent, and to gather its clean water, and to send it away to the 4 thirsty cities. And though not one soul in the valley heard the scratch of those distant pens, and though the water would not rise for another lifetime yet, and though the sheep would still be washed, and the dead still buried, and the bridge still crossed for many a long year to come, still on that quiet day, without any bell being rung, or any word being spoken in the dale, The long golden afternoon of the valley of Derwent came quietly to its noon and began, by the width of one held breath, to lean toward its evening. But that evening is a good way off yet, and there is no need at all to hurry toward it. Tonight the sun is still high over the little villages. The river still runs brown and cool under the Packhorse Bridge. The hammer still rings in the smithy, and the smoke still goes up straight and blue from the chimneys of Derwent and Ashopton, and the sheep are on the tops, and the bell is in the tower, and the dead are quiet in their green and tilted churchyard, and all is well, and all is well, and all shall be. For a good while longer, well. So let the picture of the living valley settle over you now like a warm and faded quilt. The two little stone villages in the green cup of the moors, safe and whole and utterly unaware, and let it grow soft, and let it grow dim, and let it carry you gently down. We know now, you and I, what is coming for that valley, slowly, over the long years, and we know that when it will come without cruelty, and that the people will be cared for, and the dead will be lifted with reverence, and the beloved bridge will be saved. But all of that is far away tonight, on the other side of much sleep, and there is nothing at all for you to do but rest. Breathe slowly. Let the valley hold you as it held its own for 200 untroubled years, and when you are ready, drift on down into the dark, and we shall walk on into the story together another time. And so we come, softly and without any hurry, to the years in which the valley first heard the sound of the modern age coming up the road toward it. Nothing frightening happened all at once. There was no single morning on which the world changed. There was only, over a long slow while, a gathering of men and plans and iron and stone at the far quiet head of the valley, up on the high empty moor above the two little villages, where the peat lay deep and the curlews called, and hardly anyone but a shepherd or a jagger had ever had reason to go. Keep the two villages of Derwent and Ashopton sitting there below in your mind, just as they were, warm and lamplit and certain of themselves, the church tower steady, the inn-door open, the mill wheel turning in the brown water. They are safe all through this chapter. Nothing that we are about to build will touch them for many, many years yet. What comes now happens above and beyond them, up on the bare tops where no cottage stood, and the villagers will go down to the church and up to the fields and along to market all through it, watching the great works gather at the head of their valley, as you might watch weather building far off over the hills, something enormous and slow and not, they thought, ever quite meant for them. So let your breath go long, and let the picture stay gentle. We are only going to watch some men build 2 walls of stone across an empty part of the moor, and let the water rise behind them, and it will take them the better part of 20 years, and there is all the time in the world. The story turns, first, on a single quiet fact, and the fact is thirst. Far away over the moors, beyond the rim of these hills, the great smoky cities had gone on swelling through the whole of the last century, street upon street of them, mill upon mill, and every one of those streets and mills and back-to-back houses wanted water, wanted it clean and wanted it always, and had not got enough. Sheffield to the east, with its furnaces and its grinding wheels, Derby and Nottingham, and Leicester down in the flatter Midland country to the south. All of them drinking, washing, boiling, steaming, growing, and all of them looking about with a dry and thoughtful eye at the high wet green land of the peak, where the rain came down soft and constant off the Atlantic and ran away, unused. Down clear cold rivers to the sea, and of all that high wet green land, there was hardly a valley better shaped for the purpose than this one, narrow and steep at the head, gathering the rain off miles of spongy moor, floored with good gritstone to hold a wall, and turned conveniently side onto 4 thirsty cities that could, between them, pay for it. And so, in the last year of the old century, in 1899, an Act of Parliament was passed, in that grand dry way that Acts of Parliament have, and by it there was brought into being a thing with a very solid and reassuring name, the Derwent Valley Water Board. It is worth pausing on that, softly, because it tells you the whole shape of what follows. This was not one man's whim, and not a wicked scheme dreamed up in the dark. It was 4 cities, sitting down together like sensible neighbours who have quarrelled a little over a shared well, and agreeing at last to build one great cistern between them and share out the water fairly. The board was made up of aldermen and engineers and clerks. Careful men in good coats who kept minute books and worried about costs, and their task, set down in the act in the flat language of the law, was to go up into the Derwent Valley and gather its rain and send it, by long buried pipes, down to the taps and kettles of the 4 cities forever. There is something almost soothing, is there not, in how orderly it all was, a great and permanent change to an ancient landscape, begun not with an army but with a committee. And if you have ever sat through a committee, you will know that they proceed at a pace which no river, however patient, has any need to fear. And indeed it would be the best part of 40 years, all told, from that first Act of Parliament to the day the last of the work was truly finished, so that the whole of this great endeavour, from its beginning to its end, is a story with the tempo of moss growing on a wall, which is exactly the tempo we want tonight. Let the years come slow. There is no clock in this valley that anyone need mind. The rain would fall, and the moor would hold it, and the men would build, and the water would rise, all in their own unhurried time. And nobody watching from the door of a cottage below ever felt the ground shift under their feet, for it did not shift. It only, over lifetimes, quietly rearranged itself. Now, the plan the engineers drew up was a patient one, and it began not at the villages at all, but high above them. They meant, in the first place, to build 2 dams right up at the head of the valley, on the bare uninhabited moor, one below the other, and to catch the water there where it fell cleanest, and where drowning it would cost not a single house. The upper of the 2 would be called the Howden Dam, and the lake behind it Howden Reservoir, and a little below that, the Derwent Dam, holding back the Derwent Reservoir. Say them over gently to yourself if you like, for they are good soft names to fall asleep among. Howden above, Derwent just below. 2 grey walls of stone, one under the other, catching the water off the tops. And note the great kindness hidden in that plan, the thing that let the villagers sleep easy for another whole generation, up there where these first 2 dams would stand. There was nothing to drown but heather and peat hag and a few sheep tracks and the tumbled stones of old shooting shelters. No church, no inn, no hearth, no living soul. The men who made these first 2 lakes flooded only the empty roof of the world. Derwent and Ashopton, snug downstream, lost nothing to them at all, and watched the water gather above them as a thing that had come near, but not. They were sure, for them. But to build 2 great dams up on a trackless moor, miles from any town, in the wind and the rain and the winter dark, the board needed men, and not a handful of men, but an army of them, and this is where the quiet valley met the modern age most strangely of all. For the dams could not be built by the folk of Derwent and Ashopton, who were farmers and shepherds and a smith and an innkeeper. A few hundred souls all told who had their own work to do. They had to be built by navvies. The navvies were the great wandering labouring army of that age, the men who had dug the canals and thrown up the railway embankments across the whole of Britain, and who now went from one huge waterworks or cutting to the next, wherever in the kingdom there was earth to be moved and stone to be laid. They came in their thousands, with their wives and their children trailing after, and their picks and their barrows and their strong backs and their thirst of quite another kind, up the valley and onto the moor, until there were more of them by far than there were villagers. A whole shifting population of strangers arrived in the high quiet country to build the works. And it is worth dwelling for a soft moment on what a strange meeting that must have been, told without any alarm, for it was a peaceable meeting in the end. Here on the one side were the valley folk, whose families had held the same fields and sat in the same church pews for longer than anyone could count, who knew every stone and every sheep track and every leaning gravestone by name, and who had never in their lives seen more than a few dozen faces gathered in one place, and those all faces they had known since childhood. And here on the other side came the navvies, rootless and travelled, who had dug in Scotland and in Wales and in the fens and in the outskirts of a dozen cities, who owned little more than they could carry and belonged to nowhere and to everywhere, and who now came pouring up into this settled ancient hush with their broad accents from far counties and their loud tired laughter and their enormous appetites. The two peoples looked at one another, no doubt, with a good deal of wariness at first, the settled and the wandering, and then, being all of them human and all of them cold and wet on the same moor, they got on, more or less, as people mostly do, and the valley took a breath and made room, and the great work went forward. And here you must not picture cruelty or squalor. For the board, being careful men who kept minute books, did a thing that was for its day quite remarkable and quite kind. They did not let the navvies sleep rough in the heather or crowd into the barns of Derwent. Instead, up on the hillside above where the works would be, they built the workers a whole town of their own, from nothing, on purpose, and it is one of the gentlest and oddest little corners of this whole story, and its name was Birchinley. Birchinley, almost nobody ever called it that. Almost everybody called it Tin Town, because it was built, every wall and roof of it, of corrugated iron, that ribbed grey sheeting that pings in the rain and grows warm in the sun, and a whole village of it went up along the valley side, hut after hut in tidy rows, until from a distance it must have looked like a long silver ribbon laid out on the green. And it was not a mere camp of sheds, but a proper little town, thought out and provided for. There were dwelling huts for the married men and their families, each with its own small rooms and its own iron stove, and there were larger huts for the single men to lodge in, and threaded among them everything a town could need. There was a shop, and then more than one shop, so that a woman need not walk miles down to Bamford for a reel of thread or a twist of tea. There was a school with a real schoolmaster, where the navvy's children learned their letters to the sound of the wind on the tin. There was a hospital, a proper one, with beds and a nurse, for the work was hard and heavy and men were hurt by falling stone and turning wheels, and it was a good deal better to be mended up on the hill than carried, jolting, all the long way to a town. There was a public house, of course, for these were navvies, and it would have been a braver committee than this one that tried to keep them dry. And there was, sitting in careful balance against the public house, a mission hall, where a kindly soul came to preach and to coax the men toward temperance and hymn-singing on a Sunday, with, one imagines, a modest and hard-won success. There was a bath-house, a great luxury, where a man caked to the eyebrows in more mud and stone dust could get himself clean. There was a recreation room, and there were sports, and there were even in time small tidy gardens got up outside some of the huts, cabbages and a few flowers coaxed out of that thin cold soil by women who meant to make a home wherever they were set down, even here, even in a town of tin on a Derbyshire moor that everyone knew would be pulled to pieces the moment the dams were done. And there is the quiet, kindly irony of Tin Town, told softly, for it is worth a gentle smile before sleep and not a frown. Here was a whole village, full of life, full of families and firelight and school bells and christenings, and a nurse in a clean apron and cabbages in little gardens, a village that was born and lived and died complete. And its entire and only reason for existing was to house the men who were building the drowning of other villages. A village raised up to make the lakes that would one day help swallow Derwent and a Shopton, and a village that was itself, from its very first tin nail, meant to vanish utterly the moment its work was finished. It kept no churchyard, for it did not mean to stay. It planted its cabbages knowing they might be its last. And when you look for Tin Town on the hillside today, you will find, for all its schools and shops and hospital and hymn-singing, almost nothing at all. A few flat platforms in the bracken, a line or two of old foundation, a scatter of rusted iron gone back into the peat. A town that built lakes and then, its task done, quietly took itself away. And yet while it stood, how alive it was. Think of a winter evening up at Tin Town, if it eases you towards sleep to think of it. The dark coming down early over the moor, the wind finding every seam in the iron and making the whole town hum and sing a little in the gusts. Lamplight in the small square windows, one after another, down the long tin rows. The smell of 100 stoves burning, of stewing mutton and boiling tea, and drying wet wool steaming on a line strung across a warm little room. Children who had been born who knows where, on the works before this one, doing their sums at the tin schoolhouse, and then racing home along the boarded paths between the huts. A fiddle, maybe, starting up somewhere down the row, and a stamping of heavy boots. The nurse making her last round of the little hospital, turning down a lamp. The chapel dark and the public house bright, and both of them, in their different ways, doing the Lord's work of getting weary men through a long cold night. It was a home. It was never meant to be a home, and everyone in it knew it was borrowed and temporary and doomed, and they made it a home anyway, because that is the thing that people cannot help but do, wherever they are set down, even on a bare wet hill in a town of tin. There is no sadness you need to carry in that. It did what it was made for, and then it went, as a good tool is put back in the drawer, and its people who were used to going packed up and went on to the next great work somewhere else across the country, as they always had. But for the 20-odd years that it stood, Tin Town was alive, and up above it, day by day and year by year, the two great dams rose out of the moor. And oh, they rose slowly. This is a chapter for the patient and the sleepy, and there was nothing hurried about it. First the hire of the two, the Howden Dam, was begun, along about 1901, and it was not finished and holding water until about 1912, so that is 11 years more or less of steady labour for one wall of stone. And the Derwent Dam a little below it was begun about 1902, and not done until about 1916, which is 14 years more or less for the second. Think of that, softly. A boy who was born in the valley in the year the first stone was laid would have been near enough a grown man, ready to go off to a war nobody yet dreamed of, before the last stone of the second dam was set. Whole childhoods passed to the sound of that work, whole small lives began, and ended in the shadow of those rising walls. Old shepherds who had watched the first trench dug went to their rest in Derwent churchyard before the water ever stood behind the finished dam, and their grandchildren, who had never known the valley without the works in it, grew up thinking the sight of a half-built dam and a plume of steam on the hillside was simply the ordinary furniture of the world, as children always do, taking whatever they are born into for the way things have always been. And all that long while, down in the two villages, the deep old rhythms went on turning exactly as they had for centuries, the lambing and the hay and the harvest and the slaughtering, the market days and the christenings and the burials, so that up on the moor the future was being poured in gritstone, and down in the valley the past went quietly about its business, and the two of them lived side by side in the same green cleft of the hills for the best part of a generation, and neither for a long time troubled the other at all. And it was work of a very particular and heavy and beautiful kind, for these were not the great banked earth dams of a later age, but true walls of dressed gritstone, built up block on squared block like the wall of a vast cathedral or a castle laid across the throat of the valley. And gritstone is the local stone, the very bones of the peak, hard and dark and honest, but it is heavy beyond the telling, and every one of the countless blocks that went into those two dams had to be got out of the ground and cut and shaped and hauled and lifted and set exactly, by men and horses and cranes and engines and endless patient care. Much of the stone did not even come from close by, but from a great quarry some way off, and to carry it, and to carry the sand and the cement and the coal and the men and the very bread of Tin Town, the board did another remarkable thing. They built a railway. A special railway, laid on purpose up the wild valley, winding along the hillside from the main line far below, climbing gently so the loaded wagons could grind their slow way up to the works, and the empty ones roll back down. A little steam railway, all its own, puffing up and down that green, trackless valley for 20 years, carrying stone up and, one likes to think, carrying the odd delighted navvy's child down for a rare day out. And vanishing again, rails and sleepers and all, the moment the dams were done, so that today you might walk the line of it as a soft green shelf along the hillside and never guess an engine ever breathed there. And the work those men did, day upon day, was slow and it was cold and it was very often wet, for this is the high peak, where the rain comes sideways off the moor and the mist can sit in the valley for a week together, and the winter closes in early and lets go late. Picture them at it through all the seasons, for the building did not stop for weather. In the long light of a northern summer evening the wall would grow a few more courses, the stone warm to the hand, the midges rising off the water, the men working on till it was almost too dark to set a block true. And in the deep of winter the same men would be up on the same wall with the wind trying to pluck them off it, and the mortar freezing, and their hands gone past feeling, and still the barrows would come, and still the cranes would swing, and still, block by frozen block, the great grey thing would climb. It asked a great deal of them, that work, and now and then, as such work always does, it took a great deal too. For stone is heavy, and cranes can fail, and a wet plank underfoot is a treacherous thing, and there were men hurt on those dams, and some who did not go home, and that is a quiet sorrow folded into the foundations of every great work of that age, and we may pause on it gently, and be glad of the little hospital up at Tin Town with its beds and its nurse, and go on. So picture the whole thing now, all together, as one slow, calm scene to sink into. The high moor, the wind, the curlews, two long grey walls of gritstone climbing course by course out of the valley floor, year upon year, the taller upper one and the lower one below it. The special little railway threading its stone up the hillside breathing steam. Tin Town strung out silver along the slope, its chimneys smoking, its school bell ringing thin on the wind, its cabbages in their small brave gardens, cranes swinging, horses leaning into their collars, men on the growing wall, small as ants against the great grey face of it, laying the honest heavy stone, and each of the two dams, when it was near its full height, was finished at its outer end, not with a plain parapet, but with a pair of tall stone towers, round and castle-like, standing up bold at either side of the wall, like the towers of some old fortress set down improbably on a Derbyshire moor. They were built partly for the workings of the dam, and partly, one suspects, because the engineers of that age simply could not resist making a thing so mighty also look magnificent. And who is to blame them? And those grand twin towers of the Derwent Dam in particular were to have, 30 years later, a strange and famous afternoon of their own that we shall come to in its proper place, far off yet, and no part of tonight's piece. For now they are only new, only just built, pale and clean-edged and rather pleased with themselves, standing up out of the moor. And then, dam by dam, the walls were done, and the sluices were closed, and the thing they had all been made for at last began to happen. The water rose. It rose without a sound and without a struggle. The Derwent, that clear cold young river coming down off the tops, met the new wall of stone and could go no further, and so it did the only thing water can do, which is to wait and to widen and to climb. Slowly over the weeks and the seasons, the empty upper moor behind each dam filled and became a lake. The peaty pools joined hands. The heather at the water's edge went under, and then the old sheep tracks, and then the tumbled shooting shelters and the milestones of ways that no one would walk again, all of it settling quietly beneath a rising sheet of cold clear water that had never been there before and would never now go away. And where there had been miles of brown moor and one thin winding river, there lay instead two long still reservoirs, one above the other, holding up to the grey sky a great calm mirror of cloud and hill, so that a shepherd coming over the tops who had known the old empty valley all his life might stop and stand a while, not grieving exactly, for nothing that he loved had drowned, but marvelling at how the shape of the world he was born into had been quietly and forever changed by the patient hands of men. And here is the gentle reassuring heart of this whole long chapter, the thing to hold as you drift. so that no worry follows you down into sleep. Not one house had been lost. Not one hearth, not one grave, not one living soul turned out of doors. These first two great lakes, Howden above and Derwent below, had drowned only the empty roof of the moor, the bare high ground where no village ever was, exactly as the careful men with their minute books had planned. Down below, round the bend and along the valley, the two little villages still stood, whole and warm and unharmed. Derwent with its old hall and its church and its packhorse bridge, a Shopton with its inn and its chapel where the roads crossed the river. Their people had watched the great works of 20 years gather at the head of their valley, had heard the little railway puff and the blasting echo off the crags, and had seen Tin Town glimmer silver on the hill, and then, its labour finished, quietly disappear again. And now they saw the two new lakes lying calm and full above them, and they thought, not unreasonably, that the thing was done. The cities had their water, the moor had given what the moor could spare. The engineers were packing up their theodolites and going home. Tin Town was being unbolted sheet by sheet and carted away, and its restless people were scattering off across the country to the next great cutting or waterworks, taking their cabbages and their children and their picks with them, so that within a season or two the hillside where a whole town had rung with life stood empty and still and going green, as though it had dreamed the town and now forgotten it. The railway was lifted, rail by rail. The scaffolding came down. The moor, changed forever but no longer troubled, grew quiet again above its two new lakes. And the age of water, which had come up the valley like slow weather over the hills, seemed to have crested and passed the villages by, brushing near them but sparing them, taking only the empty high ground and leaving the lived-in valley floor untouched. The men of Derwent went on mending their walls, the women of a Shopton went on at the pump and the wash-tub. The bells of the little church rang on for weddings and for burials as they always had. And if anyone, sitting of an evening at the door of the Shopton Inn and looking up the valley toward the pale new dams, ever felt a small cold thought go by, a thought that ran something like, "They liked our water well enough up there on the empty moor, and there is a deal more of us down here where the good water gathers thickest of all. Why then, they will have put it from their minds, and finished their drink, and gone into bed, and slept." For it was all done now, surely the water had had its fill. And the two little villages settled back into their long quiet, safe as they had ever been, while high above them the two new lakes lay black and still under the stars, holding the reflected moor, waiting, with all the patience in the world, for the years to turn. And so the new century settled over the valley, and for a little while the valley let itself believe that the worst was already behind it. The two great stone dams stood finished up on the high moor, Howden above and Derwent below it, their tall castle towers keeping their long patient watch over the water that had gathered behind them. The special railway had been lifted away, sleeper by sleeper, and the grass had begun to grow over the bed of it, and the Tin Town at Birchinley, that whole clattering corrugated village of navvies and their families, had been taken down and carried off and scattered to the four winds, until there was almost nothing left of it but a few flat terraces in the bracken where the huts had stood. The moor had drowned its empty upper reaches and kept its two living villages, and the people of Derwent and of a Shopton, who had watched the strangers come and the strangers go, breathed out, and told one another that it was over now, and turned back to the sheep and the hay and the slow round of the year. And who could blame them for thinking so? They had given the high empty moor to the water, and the high empty moor had cost no one their home, and it seemed only fair, only decent, only reasonable, that having given so much the valley should now be let alone. That is the way of things, and there is a great deal of comfort in it, and a great deal of gentle folly in it too, for the valley did not yet know that the thirst it had helped to slake was a thirst that only grows with the drinking. Settle back now, and let that thought rest lightly on you. The way a cat settles on a warm window-sill and asks nothing further of the afternoon. There is nothing here to keep you awake. It is all long finished, and all long forgiven, and we are only walking through it slowly together, at the safe distance of many years, so that you may lay it down softly and go to sleep. So the years between the wars came on, the 1920s and then the 1930s, and up in the valley they were quiet years. Quiet in the good sense, and quiet in the sadder sense both. The way a house grows quiet when the children have grown and gone. The two upper reservoirs were part of the scenery now. Folk had stopped thinking of them as new. Anglers came for the trout, ramblers came in their heavy boots and their flat caps to walk the moor and admire the dams, and on a still evening the water lay behind the great walls as smooth and dark as poured pewter, and the curlews called across it, and the whole thing looked as though it had been there since the making of the world. Grass had grown over the wound of the old workings, heather had crept back over the terraces where the tin huts had stood. A child born in the valley in those years would have grown up thinking the reservoirs no stranger than the hills, would have paddled at their margins and skated on their frozen bays in a hard winter, and never once thought of them as new-made things, as things that men had raised in a single lifetime out of a wild, empty glen. That is how quickly the land forgives, and how quickly we forget that anything was ever otherwise, and there is a comfort in that too, if you look at it kindly, for it means that the raw new hurt of any change grows over in time, and greens, and softens, and becomes at last only the shape of the place, loved as it is. The valley had learned to love its two lakes. It did not yet know it would be asked to become one. But far away over the moors, out beyond the rim of the hills where the valley could not see them, the cities were doing what cities do. They were growing. Sheffield was growing, and Derby and Nottingham and Leicester and all the smaller towns that clung to their skirts, and every new street of little brick houses meant new taps. And every new tap meant more water wanted, and more water, and always more, for a city is a thing that is never quite full. The two upper reservoirs that had seemed so vast when they were filling, that had drowned whole square miles of moor and seemed enough to slake a nation, were, it turned out, not enough. They were never going to be enough. The clerks and the engineers of the water board did their sums in their offices in the towns, filling their ledgers with the long neat columns of figures that decide the fate of far-off places, and the sums all came out the same. And the sums said, plainly and without any malice at all, that the valley would have to give again. And this time it would have to give the part it had kept. This is the turn the whole night has been bending toward, and I will tell it to you as gently as I know how, because there is no need to tell it any other way. Between the wars the board resolved to build a third dam, and a greater one, far down the valley below the two it had already made, down where the two rivers met and the ground opened out and the villages stood. It would not be a wall of stone this time, like Howden and Derwent with their proud grey towers. It would be a dam of a different and humbler kind, a vast long bank of earth and clay, a great soft rampart heaped clean across the whole width of the valley, with a heart of puddled clay sealed inside it to hold the water back, and grass growing on its sloping sides, so that in time it would look less like a work of engineering and more like one more green hill that the valley had always had. Ladybower, they would call it, after a wood and a brook of that old sweet name that lay along the ground it would cover. And the water that gathered behind that long earthen bank would not stop where the empty moor stopped. It would rise and spread and fill the wide green floor of the living valley, and cover the fields and the lanes and the gardens and the doorsteps, and cover Derwent and cover a Shopton, and leave nothing above the surface but the memory of them. There it is. That is the whole of the sorrow, said once, quietly, so that it need not be dreaded through the rest of the night. I have told it to you plainly and early, as this channel always does, because there is no kindness in keeping you in suspense, and no rest to be had from a story that hides its ending like a card up its sleeve. You know now where the water is going. You know now what it will cover, and knowing it, you may let the whole matter soften and slow, and follow the rest of it not with your nerves, but with your slow and drifting attention, the way you might follow the last of a familiar tune that you already know the shape of, letting it carry you down rather than keep you up. Now let us walk back down into the valley, and be with the villagers while they were still themselves in the last of their ordinary years, before the certainty came fully upon them. For the strange thing about a doom that is decided far away, in offices, in figures, in Acts of Parliament, is how slowly it travels the last few miles to the place it means to undo. There was no thunderclap over Derwent. There was no morning when the whole valley woke and knew. The knowledge came the way the mist comes up the valley on an autumn evening, a little at a time, cold and grey and soft, first a word in the market at Bakewell, then a paragraph in the county paper, then a letter to this farmer and that. Then a man from the board come out on the train and up the road in a motor car, walking the fields with a rolled plan under his arm and a measuring chain, looking at the land in the particular way that men look at land they mean to take. And the valley, watching him from its gates and its doorways, began slowly to understand. There is a kind of grief that comes not all at once, but by degrees, over years, so gently that on no single day can you say that this was the day the heart broke. And that was the grief that settled over Derwent and Ashopton through the 1930s, as certainty gathered like water behind a wall. The act was got. The plans were drawn and passed and printed. The compulsory purchase, that cold and careful phrase, came into its slow machinery, and one by one the farms and the cottages and the fields and the mill and the inn and the very churchyard were valued and set down in the ledgers of the board, each with its price, each to be bought whether its owner wished to sell or no. For the law had decided, and the cities were thirsty, and against a thirsty city and an Act of Parliament a hill farmer and a village innkeeper have very little to set but their love of a place, and love of a place, alas, does not appear in the ledgers. And here I must say the thing that this story most wants said, and say it plainly so that you may sleep the easier for it. There was no villain in this. There was no cruel lord and no wicked scheme, no burning and no driving out, none of the old hard clearance that other valleys knew. The men of the board were not monsters. They were engineers and clerks and surveyors, doing a lawful and, in its way, a decent thing, making sure that a great many people in a great many streets far away would have clean water to drink and to wash their children in and to put out their fires, which is no small kindness, and no shameful aim, and the people of the valley, for the most part, knew it. They did not like it. How could they like it? But they understood it, in the slow, fair-minded way of country people who have lived their whole lives at the mercy of weather and season and things larger than themselves, and who know that sometimes the small good thing must give way to the large one, and that this is sad, and that sadness is not the same as injustice. It was for the common good. It was water for the cities. It was, when all the ledgers were closed and all the arguments were done, simply need, meeting a quiet green place that happened to hold the answer. And need is not wicked, only heavy, and it lay down upon the valley with its whole heavy weight, and the valley bore it. There is a certain dignity in the way that quiet people bear a thing they cannot change, a dignity that has nothing of defeat in it and everything of patience, and the people of the valley had that dignity in full measure. They wrote their letters and they went to their meetings and they said their piece, as was right, and when the piece was said and the decision stood, they turned, most of them, to the long, slow business of leaving well. They mended what they were going to abandon. They whitewashed walls that would soon be under fathoms of water, because a thing worth doing is worth doing tidily, and because the habits of a lifetime do not stop the day the sentence is read. They dug their gardens for one more spring of potatoes they would not be there to lift. And if that strikes you as strange, it should not, for it is exactly what any of us would do, and exactly what we all do, every day, tending lives and homes that we know in our hearts we cannot keep forever, and finding in the tending itself something steady to hold to while the larger tide comes in. So the emptying began, and it began the way all endings truly begin, not with a great scene, but with 100 small ones. It began with the young people leaving first, as young people do, taking the offered price and the offered help, and going off to the towns for work, so that the villages grew a little greyer and a little quieter each year. A few more empty chairs at the chapel, a few more farms where the old couple managed alone with a hired man where once there had been sons. It began with the fields changing hands, and the board's men coming to count the walls and the barns. It began with the school. There is something about the closing of a village school that tells a village, more surely than any letter from any office, that its life is folding up, for a school is a promise a place makes to its own future. And when the desks are cleared and the little pegs in the cloakroom hang empty and the door is locked for the last time, the promise is quietly withdrawn, and everyone understands. The children who had chanted their tables and scratched their sums on their slates were sent away to schools in other places, down at Bamford and Hope and Bradwell, carried off each morning further and further from the valley that had been the whole of their world, and the schoolrooms stood empty, with the map of the empire still pinned to the wall and the dust settling on the master's high desk, waiting, like everything else now, for the water. And it began, most tenderly of all, in the little church of Derwent Woodlands, the plain gritstone church with its square tower and its short spire that had stood since about 1757, where the valley had been christened and married and buried through 6 quiet generations. The services grew smaller. The congregation thinned as the families moved away until there were more empty pews than full ones, and the hymns that had once filled the small stone box of the nave rose thin and few into the roof. And then there came a last service, though I do not think anyone quite let themselves call it that at the time, for there is a mercy in not naming the last of a thing until it is safely past. A last gathering, a last blessing, a last shutting of the heavy door and turning of the great cold key, and the little church of Derwent Woodlands, that had heard so many prayers, was given over to the silence, and then, in time, to the water. Down at Ashopton, where the 2 valleys met and the Snake Road came over the bridge, the ending wore a different and more worldly face, but it was the same ending. The Ashopton Inn had stood at the crossroads pouring its ale for the drovers and the carriers and the coach travellers for longer than anyone could rightly say, a warm-lit window at the meeting of the ways, a place to bait a horse and warm a traveller and hear the news of the road. And now the road itself was to be lifted up onto a great new viaduct and carried clean over the top of where the inn would lie drowned, and the carriers would rumble across the sky where the taproom had been, and never know it, and never stop. The last pint was pulled at the Ashopton Inn as quietly as the last hymn was sung at Derwent Church, and the shutters went up, and the sign came down, and the smithy fire that had glowed at the crossroads for lifetimes was let go cold and grey at last, and the anvil that had rung out over the valley on 1,000 frosty mornings rang out no more. It is a curious thing to stand in the mind at that dark crossroads on that last evening, and to think how many feet had passed over those stones, how many wet travellers had blessed the yellow window of the inn and turned in out of the weather, how many horses had been baited and shod, how many bits of news and gossip and courtship and quarrel had passed across that threshold in the long life of the place, and to know that all of it was over now, not because the place had failed, not because anyone had done it wrong, but simply because the road was going up into the air and the ground was going down under the water. The world does that sometimes. It closes a good thing not for any fault of the thing, but because the shape of everything around it has changed, and there is no one to be angry with, and nowhere to send the grief, and so it settles quietly into the stones and stays there, and only a story like this one, told softly at night, ever comes to lift it out again. The chapel emptied, the shop shut its door, and the crossroads that had been a place where everyone passed and everyone met, became a place where no one lived at all. But now I come to the part of this chapter that I have most wanted to bring you to, because it is the part that turns this from a story of loss into a story of care, and it is the gentlest thing in the whole long tale, and it is the thing I most want you to be holding in your mind as you drift down towards sleep tonight. When a valley is to be drowned, the living can be moved. The living can be given a price and a new house and a cart for their furniture and a hand with the flitting, and though it breaks their hearts to go, they can go, and make new lives in new places. And they did. But there were others in the valley who could not pack a cart, and could not be reasoned with, and could not walk out over the hill to a new home, and those were the dead, lying in the churchyard of Derwent, under their leaning stones, in the ground that had been consecrated for them, and had held them, some for a few years and some for very near 200, in the quiet company of their own kin. And the men of the board, the clerks and the engineers with their cold ledgers, did not leave them there. They did not shrug and let the water close over the churchyard and think it none of their concern, as they might so easily have done, for the dead do not vote, and the dead do not petition, and the dead lodge no objection with any office. Instead, with a care that I find, every time I tell it, quietly wonderful, they lifted them. One by one, grave by grave, with reverence and with proper record, the dead of Derwent were raised from the ground that was to be flooded, and lifted and carried away out of the valley, up the road and over the hill, to be laid down again in ground that would stay dry, in consecrated earth that the water would never reach, most of them at the churchyard of St. John the Baptist at Bamford, a village not far off, where you may find them to this day. The drowned village is dead, resting safe and dry above the waterline, while their old homes lie deep beneath it. Think of the tenderness in that. Think of the men working slowly and gravely in the churchyard, reading the worn names off the stones and writing them down so that no one should be lost, and the old headstones lifted and carried too, so that a grandmother who had lain in Derwent should lie under her own right name at Bamford, and her people should always be able to find her. It would have been so much easier to leave them. It would have cost so much less to leave them. No one far away would ever have known. And they did not leave them, and that is the mercy at the heart of this drowning, that even the dead were carried to safety before the water came, and not one soul of the valley, living or dead, was abandoned to the flood. And I like to imagine, though I cannot prove it, that some of the living went up to Bamford in those years to see the new resting places of their people, and stood in the strange dry churchyard among the familiar old stones set in the unfamiliar new ground, and found it a comfort that a woman who had been used to walking of a Sunday to her mother's grave in Derwent found she could still walk to it, only in a different village now, up a different lane, and that her mother had come with her, in a manner of speaking, out of the reach of the rising water and into the light. The bones of the valley went where the valley went. That is the shape of it. The people carried away in carts, the dead carried away in reverence, and the whole long-rooted community that had seemed as fixed as the moor itself, taken up gently and set down again somewhere safe and dry, so that what could be saved was saved, and only the empty stones and the empty fields were left for the water to have. When I think of the Upper Derwent, I think of that first. Before I think of the loss, I think of the great gentle courtesy of it, a whole community folded up and moved and cared for, down to its last forgotten grave. And when the living were gone, and the dead were gone, and the church was silent, and the inn was dark, and the school was locked, and the fields lay ownerless, then, and only then, came the men with the tools and the charges to take the buildings down. For an empty house left standing in a reservoir is a danger and a snare, a thing that rots and falls and floats and fouls the water, and so the emptied village had to be unmade, stone from stone, before the flood was let in. And here even the grandest thing in the valley was not spared. Derwent Hall, the stone Jacobean manor that the Balgi family had raised about 1672, that had stood for the better part of 300 years, that had been the great house of the valley, and had ended its long life gently as a hostel for young walkers, was brought down, its roof stripped, its fine old timbers taken out, its mullioned windows emptied, and at the last its proud stone walls thrown down with charges about the year 1944, until the house that had watched over the valley for near 3 centuries was a heap of grey rubble on the grass, and then not even that. The farms went the same way, and the cottages, and the mill that had ground the valley's corn, and the smithy and the shop, pulled down, carted off, or left in low broken stumps that the water would soon cover, until the whole floor of the valley, that had been a lived-in place of roofs and gardens and lanes and lamplight for so many 100 years, was swept bare and clean and open to the sky. Made ready, as a bed is stripped and made ready, for the long sleep of water that was coming. There is a particular quiet that comes to a place after the demolishers have gone, a quiet deeper than the ordinary quiet of the country, for it is the quiet of a place that has finished being what it was, and has not yet begun to be the next thing. The rubble settled, the dust laid itself down, the nettles and the willow herb, which love nothing better than a ruin, began already to feather up green among the fallen stones, as if the wild moor were reaching a first tentative hand back over the ground that men had held for so long. And the valley waited, roofless and swept, under the wide grey Derbyshire sky. Only the church tower, for a while, they let stand, but that is a matter for tomorrow's telling. And so we come to the end of this chapter, and the valley lies before us empty and hushed and waiting, in the last months before the river was stopped. Picture it, if you like, as a last soft image to carry down into sleep. The fields are ownerless and going to seed. The walls still run their old grey lines across the slopes, but there is no smoke from any chimney, for there are no chimneys now. The lanes lead from nowhere to nowhere. The bridge stands over the river with no one to cross it. The wind comes down off the moor as it always has, and moves through the empty doorways where doors used to be, and finds no one home. The dead are gone up the hill to Bamford, safe and dry. The living are gone over the moor to new streets and new work, carrying the valley folded small inside them. And the great earthen dam grows higher and longer across the mouth of the valley, day by day, a rising green wall of clay and stone, holding back, for just a little while yet, the water that has been promised this ground. Nothing here is frightening. Nothing here is cruel. It is only an empty green valley on a grey still evening, waiting, patient and swept and ready, the way the whole world waits in the last hour before sleep, when the work is done and the house is quiet and there is nothing left to do but let go. Let your breath go long and slow, the way the wind goes long and slow down the empty valley. Let the last of the day's small cares be carried off over the moor with the departing carts. There is nothing you need to hold on to now. The valley let go of everything it had, gently, and was at peace, and you may let go of this waking day just as gently, and be at peace too. Tomorrow, in the next chapter, the river will at last be stopped, and the water will begin its slow, blameless climb up the fields, and we will watch the young airmen come droning low over the reservoir in the middle of the war, and see the church tower stand alone above the rising lake. But all of that is for tomorrow, and none of it is anything to fear, and you need not stay awake for any of it. For now there is only the empty valley, swept and quiet under the evening, and your own slow breath, and the soft weight of the blankets, and the lamp growing dim. Rest now. The valley is ready for its long sleep, and so, I think, are you. And so we come to the quiet centre of the whole story, the part where the water finally arrives. And I want you to know before we begin that there is nothing here to startle you. We are looking at all of this from a very long way off, the way you might look at an old dim painting on the far wall of a shadowed room, a painting of a valley and a rising lake, its colours gone soft and brown with age, its edges lost in the varnish of many years. Nothing in it can reach us. Everyone in it has long since gone home. We are only looking gently from the warm side of a great deal of time, and if your eyes should close while we look, that is entirely as it should be. In the last of the years we spoke of, the valley of the Derwent had been made ready. The villages were emptied. The dead had been lifted with great care and carried away to rest on dry ground at Bamford. The hall was down. The farms were down. The cottages were down. The little school stood silent with its door hanging open on nothing, and the whole green floor of the valley lay hushed and swept and waiting, the way a room lies waiting after the furniture has been taken out, and only the pale squares on the walls remember where the pictures hung. All that was left to do now was the simplest thing of all, and the slowest and the most complete. All that was left to do was to stop the river, and let the water come. It began, as these things do, with a wall. Far down at the lower end of the valley, below where the two rivers met, the men of the Water Board had spent long years raising the great new dam of Ladybower, and this one was not a wall of stone like the two proud castle-towered dams up on the moor above. This one was an earth dam, a vast soft bank of clay and rubble and rolled earth, a whole broad hill of the stuff laid down course by patient course across the throat of the valley, wide enough to carry a road along its crest, so gentle in its slope that a stranger walking over it in later years might not quite understand that he was walking over the thing that held back a lake. And when at last the dam was high enough and settled enough and the engineers were satisfied, they closed it. That is a very grand phrase for a very quiet act. Somewhere down in the works, in a cold chamber of concrete, a valve was turned, a great iron gate was let down, and the River Derwent, which had run freely down out of the moor since the ice first melted off these hills, was very politely and very firmly asked to stop going anywhere, and the river, having no opinion on the matter, simply began to pool. This was in the year 1943, in the middle of a long and weary war, and the filling of Ladybower was in no hurry at all. That is the first thing to understand about the drowning of a valley, and it is a very restful thing to understand. It does not happen the way it happens in a dream, all at once a wall of water rushing down and covering everything in a single roaring moment. It happens the way the tide comes in over a wide flat sand, so slowly that you can sit and watch it and never quite catch it moving, and yet turn away for an hour and find the whole world rearranged. The water did not pour into the valley, it gathered, it crept. It rose against the closed dam a hand's breadth in a day, and then another hand's breadth, and it spread sideways as it rose, feeling its way out across the lowest ground first, filling the old cut of the river brimful, and then quietly overflowing its banks into the meadows on either side. In the first weeks you would hardly have called it a lake at all. You would have called it a flooding, the sort of thing a wet autumn brings to any low field, a sheet of still brown water lying in the bottoms, with the tops of the rushes standing up through it and the drowned grass showing green and wavering just beneath the surface. But this flood did not go down again when the rain stopped. This flood had been told to stay, and it stayed, and each morning it was a little wider and a little deeper than the morning before, and the valley began, very slowly, to disappear. It took the low places first, as water always does, for water is the most patient and the most level-headed thing in all the world, and it never once tries to climb a hill it has not first surrounded. It filled the old riverbed and the boggy meadows down by Shopton, where the two valleys had met and the roads had crossed. It rose over the place where the turnpike had forded and then bridged the stream, over the site of the smithy where the fire was long cold, over the flat ground where the Shopton Inn had stood and poured its ale for the drovers and the carriers going over the Snake Road. There was nothing there now to drown, only foundations and cleared ground and the pale scars where walls had been, and the water covered them without the least fuss, the way a rising sea covers a child's castle on the beach, softening the sharp edges first, and then the whole shape, and then simply the memory of the shape, until there is only smooth water where a little kingdom stood. There were those, I think, who came to watch it happen in those first slow weeks, for people cannot help but come and watch a thing like the filling of a valley, even when the watching is a sad one. Some of them were the very folk who had lived here, rehoused now in the trim new houses down at Yorkshire Bridge below the dam, and on a fine evening one or another of them might walk back up the shore road a little way and stand on the rising bank where their fields used to be, and look out over the widening water at the place where their house had stood, which was now a little way out from the shore and a little way under it, and say nothing, and after a while walk home again. There is no bitterness in that picture. There is only the strange, quiet feeling of watching your own past turn slowly into a lake, which is a thing very few people in all of history have been given to do, and which those who did it seem to have borne with the plain, unshowy patience of hill country folk, who have always known that the weather and the water do as they please, and a body must simply get on. And the water, for its part, watched no one, and grieved for no one, and hurried for no one. It only rose. Day and night, in the sun and in the rain, while the watchers came and went and the seasons turned over the moor, it went on quietly filling the shape that had been made for it, as untroubled and as tireless as sleep itself. And where the inn had been, and the chapel and the shop, the engineers had already thrown a new thing across the valley, high up out of the water's reach, a long pale road viaduct striding over on its great arches to carry the Snake Road onward as it always had. From Sheffield away to Glossop, over the top of the new lake as if the lake had always been there. They called it the Ashopton Viaduct, after the village it stepped across and replaced, which is a small and quiet kind of monument, to give a bridge the name of the drowned place it spans, so that every motor car humming over it forever after would be saying the name of Ashopton, without ever knowing that it did so. The water climbed on. It left the lower meeting of the valleys and pushed its slow grey fingers up the main valley toward Derwent, up toward where the larger village had stood among its farms, and here it moved over ground that we have come to know a little, you and I, over these last few chapters. And so it is worth walking beside it, as it goes, quietly, at a distance, in the soft brown light of the old painting. It rose across the water meadows first, the flat rich grass by the river where the sheep had been washed each summer, where the men had stood thigh-deep in the cold clear stream, working the fleeces clean, while the lambs cried on the bank. It rose over the lane that had run along the valley floor, the lane the carts had used and the children had walked to school along, and it turned that lane into a pale ribbon shining just beneath the surface for a while, and then into nothing, into simply the bottom of a lake. It came to the foot of the Packhorse Bridge, the narrow humped medieval bridge that had carried the Jaggers and their ponies over the Derwent for longer than anyone could rightly say. But the bridge, you will remember, was not there to meet it. The bridge had been taken away. Stone by stone, each block numbered and lettered in careful paint, the old bridge had been lifted down before the water came and carried away up the valley to a high safe place, to be set up again another day, and so when the water reached the spot where it had stood for all those centuries, there was only a gap in the world, a place where a bridge should have been and was not, and the water filled the gap and rose past it, and did not know that it had missed anything at all. There is a mercy in that, a small dry mercy, that the oldest and best loved thing in the whole valley was the one thing the water was never allowed to have. Up went the lake, over the doorsteps of houses that were no longer there, over the garden walls and the garden paths and the places where the roses had been trained and the vegetables had been dug, over the cobbled yards of the vanished farms, over the sill of the old corn mill where the wheel had turned on the leat, over the graveyard that was now empty of its sleepers, its stones taken up, and its long tenants gently rehomed on the dry hill at Bamford. It rose and it rose, week upon week, month upon month, through that year and into the next, spreading wider as it deepened, licking further up the hillsides on either hand, drowning the lower fields and lapping at the feet of the dry stone walls, until the walls too went under, and the sheep grazed only on the high ground now, along a new and rising shore. And the valley became a lake, not suddenly, never suddenly, but surely a long broad sheet of still grey water lying where a green valley had lain, cradled by the same moorland hills that had always cradled it, reflecting the same wide Derbyshire sky, so that a traveller coming new to the place, and knowing nothing, might have stood on the hillside and thought only, what a fine and peaceful stretch of water. How well it fits the hills, how long it must have lain here. And that, in its way, is the kindest thing the water ever did. It fitted, it settled into the valley as though the valley had been shaped for it all along, and it wore the look of something ancient and at rest almost from the very first, and a stranger's eye forgave it everything, because a stranger's eye never knew there was anything to forgive. Now I must tell you of the other thing that was happening in the sky above the valley in those same slow-filling years, for it is a strange and famous thing, and I will tell it gently, the way everything is told here, so that it does not stir you up, but only adds another soft layer to the picture, another far-off sound in the dark. It was, as I have said, the middle of the Second World War, and a valley full of long straight sheets of water, ringed by dark hills, with great dams standing across it, turned out to be a very useful thing to a certain kind of airman. For up on the moor above the filling lake stood the two elder reservoirs we watched being built, Howden and Derwent, the ones held back by the tall stone dams with the twin round towers like the towers of a castle. And in the spring of that year, 1943, in the short soft nights of that spring, a squadron of the Royal Air Force came to the valley to practice a thing that had never been done before. They were the men of number 617 Squadron, though that name meant nothing to anyone then, and would mean a great deal to everyone soon, and they had been given a task so difficult and so strange that they could rehearse it in only a very few places in all of Britain, and the Derwent Valley was one of them. Their task, when the time came, would be to fly their great heavy bombers by night at a terrible low height, lower than a careful man would ever choose to fly, skimming just above the surface of the water toward the huge dams of a far-off enemy valley, and to do a thing to those dams that would let the water out, and to learn to fly so low, so exactly low, in the dark, over water, with hills rising all around. They needed water and hills and dams to practice over. And so they came here. Night after night in that spring the people for miles around, in the farms on the high ground and the villages down the dale, heard the deep droning come up over the moor, the heavy throb of many engines rolling down out of the dark, and looked up to see the great black shapes come sliding along the valley, low, impossibly low, their engines beating the air, following the line of the water toward the tall towers of the Derwent Dam, and roaring up and over it at the last moment and away into the night, and then turning far off, and coming again, and again, hour upon hour, learning the valley by heart in the dark. And here is the strange and gentle counterpoint that I promised you, told softly, not as a thrill but as one of those quiet ironies that history lays down without meaning to, and that you only notice, long afterward, when you are looking at the old painting from a distance. Down in the bottom of the valley, in those very same weeks, the water was rising to drown a place, filling and filling behind its patient earth dam, taking a valley and making it a lake for the sake of clean water for the cities. And up above it in the dark, the airmen were flying and flying to learn how to empty a lake, how to break a dam and let a valley's water out in one great rush. Drowning and undrowning, filling and breaking, the making of a reservoir and the rehearsal of the ruin of one, all in the same few square miles of Derbyshire moor, in the same short spring, under the same stars, and no one who stood there in the dark and felt the ground shake with the engines thought of it that way at all, because they were far too tired and far too close. And it is only from here, from the warm far side of all these years, that we can see the whole shape of it and find it strange. In the May of that year the squadron flew away south and did the thing they had practiced, over the real dams of the enemy far away, and some of them came back, and many of them did not, and the valley of the Derwent kept a small proud share in it ever after, and in time would set a plaque upon the stone tower of the Derwent Dam, and keep a little room there to remember the young men who had learnt their low and dreadful flying over these quiet waters. But that is a story for another and a louder kind of evening. Tonight we let the great plains drone away over the hills and fade, and we come back down to the water, which is doing what it does best, which is nothing, which is simply rising, patient and level and blameless, through the rest of the war. And the war did at last draw toward its close, as all things draw toward their close, gently, in the fullness of time. And by then the lake was high and broad and settled, and looked as though it had lain in the valley forever, and the men of the water board judged that their great work, the labour of nearly half a century up and down this valley, 3 dams and 3 reservoirs, and a whole engine of water to feed 4 thirsty cities, was at last complete and ready to be shown to the world. And so, on a day in the autumn, on the 25th of September in the year 1945, with the war in Europe only lately ended, and the whole tired country breathing out, the King himself came to the valley. King George VI came, and the Queen with him, up the winding roads into the high peak country, to stand above the great earth dam of Ladybower and open the reservoir, to give the seal of the crown to the drowning of the valley and the gift of its water to the cities. There would have been a platform and flags, and a gathering of dignitaries in their good coats against the September chill, and the local people come to look. And the wide new water lying grey and glittering below in the autumn light, and speeches carried off on the moorland wind. It was a great day, in its quiet official way, a day of ribbons and ceremony, and I will not trouble you with the detail of it, for ceremonies are the least restful things in all of history, and I would not have you sit through one at this hour. There is a certain gentle comedy, if you care to look for it, in the thought of a king in his good coat standing on a windy earth bank in the high peak to declare open a very great deal of water that had been busy opening itself for 2 years already, and needed no royal permission to do so, and would have gone on lying exactly where it lay whether he came or not. But that is the way of us, and a kindly way it is, to gather and put on our best coats and say aloud, before witnesses, that a thing is finished and good, even when the thing is only a lake, and the lake is only doing what water always does. And so they said it, on that cold bright autumn afternoon, with the wind off the moor tugging at the flags and the wide new water shining below. And the saying of it mattered, in the way that all such gentle ceremonies matter, because it gave the whole long sorrowful labour a shape, and an ending, and a blessing. It is enough to know that the king came, that the reservoir was opened with all proper honour, that the long labour was blessed and finished, and that the valley of the Derwent, which had been given up to the water, was now, formally and forever, a lake, and would from that day forward do the patient work it had been drowned to do, and send its clean cold water quietly away down the buried pipes to Sheffield and Derby and Nottingham and Leicester, to fill 10,000 kettles and wash 10,000 doorsteps in cities whose people would never once think of the green valley that had died to slake them. And there the story of the drowning might seem to end, with the water high and the king gone home and the lake lying complete under the autumn sky. But there was one thing left above the water. One thing had not yet gone under, and it stood there still, alone, out in the middle of the widening grey lake. And it is the last image I want to leave with you tonight, and it is a strange and quiet one, and there is nothing frightening in it, only a kind of wistful wonder. When the little church of Derwent had been made ready for the water, most of it had been pulled down, its roof and its walls and its body taken away like everything else. But its tower had been left. The square Gritstone tower, with its short spire on the top, the tower that had held the bell and watched over the churchyard and the village for near 200 years, had been judged sound enough and harmless enough to leave standing, and so it had been left, rooted on its little rise, while the water came up around its feet. And for a while in those first years, when the lake was not yet at its fullest, or when a dry season drew the level down, that tower stood up out of the water, alone, a slender grey finger of stone lifting straight and calm out of the flat grey lake, with its little spire pointing up at the Derbyshire sky exactly as it always had, only now with no church beneath it, and no village around it, and no churchyard at its foot, only the still water lying smooth on every side, and the reflection of the tower hanging upside down beneath the true one, so that it seemed to stand on the water and in the water both at once. And people came to see it. Of course they came to see it, for there are few things in this world stranger or more touching than a church tower rising alone from the middle of a lake, and word of it spread, and folk drove out from the towns on a Sunday to stand on the shore and look, and some of them took boats out over the water and rowed right up to the old tower and laid their hands on its cold wet stone, the last standing stone of a drowned village, out there in the middle of all that water, with the fish going by where the pews had been and the weed growing where the parson had stood. It became a famous sight, a wonder, a place of quiet pilgrimage, the drowned church of the Derwent lifting its tower out of the flood. And you would think, wouldn't you, that they would have let it stand, that so gentle and so moving a thing might have been allowed to keep its lonely vigil out on the water forever, a monument that cost nothing and harmed no one and said everything. But stone that stands in water is stone that is slowly loosened, and a tower with no church to brace it is a tower left to lean on nothing but itself, and the men whose business it was to fret about such things began to fret that the old tower was growing unsafe, that one day it might topple of its own accord and endanger some boatload of sightseers come to admire it. And so it was decided, sensibly and sadly, and with the best of intentions, as all the decisions in this whole story were made, that the tower must come down. And in the December of the year 1947, in the cold heart of a hard winter, they brought their chargers out to the old tower where it stood in the water, and they set them, and they stepped back, and with a single low thump that rolled away across the frozen hills, the last standing stone of Derwent was thrown down into the lake, and the spire that had pointed at the sky for near 200 years slid quietly under the grey water and was gone. And after that there was nothing above the water at all. The valley was smooth, the lake was whole. From shore to shore there was only the level water and the moving light upon it, and the reflection of the hills. And a stranger looking now would have found not the smallest sign that anything had ever stood there, not a wall, not a roof, not a spire, nothing but the calm, unbroken face of the reservoir doing its patient work under the winter sky. The villagers were wholly gone. But you must not let that word land too heavily on you as you lie there in the warm, for gone is not the same as lost, and it is certainly not the same as wronged. The people were safe, rehoused and cared for, living out their long lives in the new houses at Yorkshire Bridge and in the villages round about, carrying the valley in their memories. The dead were safe, dry and consecrated on the green hill at Bamford, sleeping as soundly as they ever had. The old bridge was safe, waiting up the valley to be built again. And the valley itself was not so much destroyed as changed into something else, something that would in its turn be loved, a great calm sheet of water lying at rest among the hills, holding the sky, holding the memory of everything beneath it, giving of itself day and night to the far-off cities. It was done, all of it, the whole long, slow, gentle drowning, and it was done at last, and there was nothing left to do but let the water lie still, and the years go by. So let the water lie still now. Let the valley be a lake, smooth and grey and complete under the winter stars, the church gone under, the airman gone away, the king gone home, the whole long labour finished and blessed and at rest. There is nothing more to happen tonight, nothing more to watch for, nothing waiting round any corner of the dark. It is all done, and it was done kindly, and it is very long ago, and the water is calm, and so may you be. Let your breath go slow and deep as the filling of a reservoir. Let the last small thoughts of the day sink quietly under, the way the lane sank, and the meadow and the mill, softening and vanishing and troubling you no more, and rest here a while by the still grey water, in the soft brown light of the old dim painting, while the valley sleeps its long sleep beneath the lake, and the hills keep watch, and nothing stirs, and all is well. And so the valley was a lake, and the lake settled slowly into being simply the valley, the way a new thing, given a little time, becomes the only thing anyone can quite remember. When the church tower came down at the tail end of 1947, the last raised finger of the old village slipped under and did not come up again, and after that there was nothing left standing to argue with the water. The reservoir lay long and grey and patient between its shoulders of moor, and the seasons turned over it as they had always turned over the fields beneath it, only now the seasons were mirrored, doubled, the sky lying down in the water and the hills leaning into their own reflections, and the whole broad sheet of Ladybower learning, year upon year, to hold perfectly still. It is a curious thing about water, how quickly it stops looking like an intruder. Within a very few years the people who came up the Snake Road, and over the new viaduct to Shopton, where the inn had been, looked out at that gleaming length of reservoir cradled in the green, and thought it one of the loveliest sights in all the Peak, and never once suspected that they were looking at a roof over two villages. The water did not tell them. Water is discreet that way. It keeps what it is given, and it keeps its own counsel, and it shows you nothing but the sky. Slowly, gently, over the 1950s and the 1960s, the raw new edges of the great engineering softened and greened and grew kind. The scars of the works healed over. Bracken came back on the spoil, and heather crept down to the new shoreline, and the young conifers that the waterboard had planted in their long dark ranks along the flanks of the valley thickened and stood tall and put down their soft brown carpet of needles, so that the whole place took on the hushed cathedral quiet of a plantation, resinous and dim and cool, with the light coming down in slow green bars between the trunks. The birds did not mind that there had been villagers. The dippers worked the streams that fed the lake exactly as they had worked the Derwent when it ran free through Derwent village, bobbing on their stones as if nothing whatever had happened. The curlews still came up in spring to the high moor above the waterline and poured out their long bubbling call over the peat, that call that is the truest voice of this country, the sound of wind made into longing. The sheep still cropped the walls of grass along the tops, and the dry stone walls still ran their grey seams up over the shoulders of the hills, minding their own business, as dry stone walls have done in these parts since long before anyone thought of drowning anything. And the water went on doing the quiet work it had been made to do. That, after all, was the whole point of it, and it must not be forgotten on this soft, slow night, because it is the part that turns the sorrow into something you can rest inside of. Every hour of every day, without fuss and without ceasing, the reservoir sent its clean, cold upland water sliding away down the long buried pipelines toward the thirsty cities, toward Sheffield and Derby and Nottingham and Leicester, toward the taps and the kettles and the washing coppers and the mill boilers of a great many people who had never heard the names Derwent or Shopton, and never would. A child in a back street in Sheffield filled a glass from the tap and drank, and it was the valley, though the child did not know it. A woman in Nottingham set the kettle on for tea, and it was the valley. A works in Derby cooled its engines and rinsed its floors, and it was the valley, poured out and given away, and never grudged. The two little drowned villages had, in the end, become the most generous places imaginable, giving themselves out by the millions of gallons to millions of strangers, a whole green parish dissolved into kindness and sent away through the dark under the moor. There are worse ways for a place to end than to become the water in everybody's cup, and the great earth dam at the foot of it all held the whole weight of that giving without ever seeming to try. A long, low, grassy bank of a thing, so broad and so gentle in its slope that a stranger might walk over its crest and never guess he was walking on the wall that kept a valley up, might take it for just another green rise of the moor, with a road along the top and sheep on its flanks, which is exactly the modest sort of dam an earth dam is, keeping its enormous secret under a coat of grass. The new road, the Snake Road, went over the water now on the tall grey arches of the Ashopton Viaduct, striding across the drowned meeting of the valleys where the old inn and the smithy had stood, and the traffic passed over it year by year. The Chara banks, and then the motor coaches, and then the endless glittering weekend cars, none of them pausing. None of them knowing that beneath the middle pier, down in the cold and the dark, lay the crossroads of a village and the cellars of a public house that had once been the busiest corner for miles. The seasons kept their slow turn over all of it, and each one dressed the reservoir differently, so that the valley never wore the same face twice. In the deep of winter the water lay iron grey under low cloud, and the surrounding tops went white with snow to the waterline, and a great hush came down over everything, and the only sound for a mile was the small chink of ice at the shore and the far bleat of a hardy sheep. In spring the larches on the flanks lit up with their tender new green, and the first lambs cried on the high fields, and the water brimmed up cold and full with the melt off the moor. In the long light of summer the reservoir turned a soft slaty blue and lay sparkling under the swifts, and holiday families spread their rugs on the grass at the water's edge, and dozed in the warm afternoon exactly where, a lifetime before, other families had made hay. And in autumn the whole valley caught fire in the quietest way, the bracken going copper, and the larches going gold, and the still water holding every burning tree upside down in its depths, so that a person standing at the shore in October seemed to stand at the lip of two forests, one of them real, and one of them drowned in light. And the people, too, went on, the families who had been moved out in the early 1940s settled into their new lives, as people do because life is stubborn and insists on being lived. Many of them had gone only a little way, down to the new hamlet of Yorkshire Bridge, that neat row of houses the Water Board had built for them just below the Great Earth Dam, so that on a still evening they could walk up the bank and stand on the crest of the embankment and look out over the smooth grey water and know, in a quiet private way that they mostly kept to themselves, exactly what lay beneath it and where their gardens had been, and which reach of that shining nothing had once been the lane they were born on. It is a strange address to hold, to live within a stone's throw of your drowned childhood, but they held it, and they raised their own children there. And those children grew up thinking the reservoir the most ordinary thing in the world, which is precisely how grief is supposed to go, softening down the generations until it is only a story the grandparents tell. And the dead went on resting, which is the gentlest thread of all this, and worth returning to now like a hand smoothing a blanket. The men and women and children who had been lifted so carefully out of Derwent churchyard before the flood came were lying safe and dry and consecrated in their new ground, most of them over at Bamford, in the churchyard of St. John the Baptist, on good high land that no water would ever reach, with their old headstones set up again above them, the same leaning weathered gritstone the village mason had cut long before, the same worn names. They had been carried up out of the valley on the last dry road and set down again in earth that would keep them, and there they stayed, undisturbed, while far below and away the water closed over the empty churchyard where they had first been laid. Nobody had been left behind under the lake. That was the promise the valley kept, and it is a good thing to carry down into sleep, that even in the drowning of a whole small world, the greatest care was taken of the smallest and stillest, and no one was forgotten, and no one was abandoned to the dark. And the Packhorse Bridge went on too, which is perhaps the tenderest keeping of all. You will remember the little medieval bridge at Derwent, the narrow humped span of gritstone that the packhorse trains had crossed for hundreds of years, worn smooth by generations of hooves and cartwheels and the slow feet of the jaggers with their strings of laden ponies. It was far too dear a thing to drown, so before the water came, it had been taken down with the greatest of care, every stone numbered and lifted and set aside, and then carried away up the valley, above the reach of all three reservoirs, to a lonely lovely spot high on the young Derwent called Slippery Stones, where the river still runs free and cold and clear over its ledges, the way it must have run past the village 1,000 years ago. And there, about 1959, patient hands built the old bridge up again, stone by numbered stone, in its proper order, so that it stands today exactly as it stood in Derwent, arching over the living river, a real bridge going about its real work of carrying walkers dry shod over the water, and a memorial at the same time, a whole drowned village remembered in one perfect surviving span. It is a good place to stand, they say, up at Slippery Stones, with the moor rolling away all around, and the peat-brown water sliding under your feet, and to think that this stone, this actual stone under your hand, was crossed by the villagers of Derwent on their way to the church and the mill and the inn, and is crossing them still, in a manner of speaking, over a different reach of the same old river. Nothing about it is sad. It is only kept. And in the little church at Bamford, and in one or two other churches round about that had taken in the scattered people of the drowned parish, some of the very furnishings of Derwent Church found new homes and went quietly on with their work. A bell that had once called the villagers of Derwent to their Sunday worship set ringing again over another green churchyard. A font that had christened Derwent babies still holding the water for the christening of new ones, an old carved beam, or a memorial tablet saved from the demolition and set carefully into a new wall, so that the little church that had been pulled down was not so much destroyed as taken apart gently and shared out among its neighbours, the way the goods of a beloved house are handed round among the family when the house itself must be given up, each piece carrying a little of the whole away with it into safekeeping. Down at the dam itself, at the great twin-towered Derwent Dam that had drowned only the empty moor and never a soul, the other memory was kept as well, the proud one, the loud one, tucked in gently beside the quiet one, for you will not have forgotten the young airmen who came droning up the reservoir in the spring of 1943, skimming low against the twin towers night after night in their heavy black machines, rehearsing over these Derbyshire waters the raid that would carry them over the dams of the Rua. That story fastened itself to the valley and never let go, and in time a little museum room was made in the west tower of the Derwent Down, and a memorial was set up, so that on a fine weekend visitors come and climb up and look out from the very parapet the airmen used for their aiming, and read the names of the crews, and then walk down along the shore of the reservoir that took the villages. And the two stories lie side by side without troubling one another, the breaking of dams and the making of one, the loud fame and the soft loss, both of them kept, both of them told, in the same green fold of moor. Every so often through the years the Royal Air Force would send an aircraft over on a summer afternoon to dip its wings above the Twin Towers in salute, and the sound would roll around the hills and out across the water and away, and then the great quiet of the valley would come back in behind it, and close over the noise as smoothly as the reservoir had closed over the fields. And meanwhile, above all this keeping and remembering, the valley had quietly become one of the best-loved places in the whole of England, which is a fine soft irony to lie back into, that a place drowned to serve the cities became within a lifetime the very place the cities came to be healed of themselves, for the water that the water board had planted, and the dark conifers, and the long shining reservoirs held in their arms of moor, made between them a landscape so calm and so beautiful that the people of Sheffield and Manchester and Derby began to come up at weekends in their thousands, not for the water this time, but for the peace of it. They built a visitor centre down at Fairholmes, in the crook of the valley below the two stone dams, with a little cafe and a place to leave the car and a rack of bicycles for hire, and from there the walkers and the cyclists set out all the year round, wheeling and strolling along the smooth lanes that run beside the water, under the larches in autumn, when the whole valley turns to rust and gold. Past the great grey castle walls of the Derwent Dam, up the long quiet reaches toward Howden and the wild moor beyond. Families come with flasks and push chairs. Old men come with binoculars and stand a long while at the water's edge saying nothing. The Ladybower Inn, that had stood just high enough on the Snake Road to keep its feet dry when all below it went under, kept its doors open and its fires lit, and went on pulling pints for the walkers exactly as the Drownder Shopton Inn had once pulled them for the drovers and the carriers, so that even the welcome of the valley was, in its way, handed on and kept alive above the waterline. On a bright, still Sunday, the reservoir carries the reflection of 100 small pleasures, the dinghies and the paddlers down on the lower water, the ranks of parked cars gleaming, the ice cream queue, the children throwing bread to the ducks along the shallows at Fairholmes, and none of it disrespectful, none of it wrong, for the surest sign that a sorrow has been fully kept is that joy is allowed to grow back over the top of it, the way grass grows over a filled-in grave, and the way. In time, laughter comes back into a house that has known a death. The valley did not want to be mourned forever, it only wanted to be remembered, and it is, and so the children may throw their bread, and the old men may stand quiet, and both are right, and both belong. And it is worth saying, softly, on such a still night as this, that the whole quarrel of it, if ever there was a quarrel, has long since gone out of the story, the way the heat goes out of a stone after the sun is down. In the years when the villages were being emptied there had no doubt been hard feelings here and there, as there always are when people must leave the place their grandparents lie in. A reluctance, a grief, a letting go that came harder to some than to others. But there was no villain in it, and there is none now. Nobody in this story acted out of cruelty. The engineers were not wicked men, only careful ones, doing a thing that a great many people genuinely needed. The water board did what it did lawfully and openly and, on the whole, kindly, building the new houses at Yorkshire Bridge, lifting the dead with reverence, saving the bridge and the bell and the font. The cities that drank the water were not greedy, only thirsty, full of ordinary families who wanted no more than a clean glass and a hot bath and a kettle that would fill. It was need, and it was sorrow, and it was slow water. And none of those three things has a face to be angry at. And so, all these years on, there is nobody left to blame, which is a great rest to the heart. For blame is a heavy thing to carry up a hill, and here there is none of it to carry. Only the tender fact of a place that was loved and given up for a good reason and remembered ever since. But the tenderest wonder of it, the thing that people come from far away to see, and that gives this whole long story its gentlest ending, is this. The valley does not stay hidden. Every so often, in a long, hot, dry summer, when the rain has held off for weeks and the cities have gone on drinking, and the reservoir has sunk lower and lower down its shelving banks, the water falls back far enough to give the secret up, and Derwent rises again. It comes back out of the cracked grey mud in the middle of the reservoir, a little more each parched week, the way a memory comes back when you stop trying to hold it down. First the tops of the walls break the surface, then the walls themselves, the low grey stumps of the cottages and the farms laid out in their old plan, room by room, so that you can walk between them and read the shape of a kitchen, a doorway, a hearth. The straight line of the old village street comes clear, running down out of the water and along the dry bed and back into the water again, going where it always went. The foundations of the mill appear, and the gateposts standing patient in their places, and here and there the base of the old war memorial that the village had raised to its own lost sons of an earlier war, itself now lost and found and lost again. The bridge foundations surface where the packhorse bridge once stood before it was carried up to Slippery Stones. And people come. Word goes round, the way it went round in 1959, and again in the great drought of 1976, and again in 1995, and in 2018, and in 2022, that Derwent has come back, that you can walk out over the dry bed and touch the bones of the drowned village, and they come in their crowds and their careful hundreds, over the caked mud, the old and the young, some of them the last grandchildren of the people who once lived there, come to stand in the roofless kitchen where a grandmother was a girl, and lay a hand on a warm dry wall that has spent 40 years or 50 under the water, and feel the strangeness and the sweetness of it, the whole village lying out under the open Derbyshire sky again for a few dry weeks, sunning itself, remembering itself, letting itself be remembered. Photographs are taken, and children are lifted up to see, and someone always finds an old iron gate hinge, or a doorstep worn hollow by feet that stopped walking 100 years ago, and stands over it a while with a strange soft feeling that is not quite grief and not quite joy, but something gentler and larger than either. The feeling of standing in the presence of time itself, made kindly and visible. And then, always, the weather turns, as the weather in these hills reliably does, and the good soft rain comes back, sweeping in grey curtains up the valley off the moor, and the streams brim, and the reservoir fills, and inch by gentle inch the water rises again over the gateposts and the hearths and the old straight street, and closes over Derwent once more, without violence, without grief, drawn back over the sleeping village like a coverlet drawn softly back over a sleeper who had only stirred, and turned, and settled deeper down, and gone on sleeping. That is where the story rests, and where we may rest with it. Not in the drowning, but in the keeping. Not in the loss, but in the long faithful remembering. For if you stand back now, at the very end, and let the whole shape of it lie open beneath you like the valley seen from the high moor at dusk, you will see that nothing here was truly lost at all. The villages of Derwent and Ashopton are gone from the map, yes, their lanes under the water, their walls under the mud, their church tower blown to gravel, and their inns and their mill and their school long since pulled down and carted away. And yet look how much of them remains, and how well. They remain in the water itself, in every clean cold glass drunk in 4 great cities to this day, the valley given away, and never used up. They remain in the bridge at Slippery Stones, whole and sound, and crossing the living river, stone for numbered stone. They remain in the quiet churchyard at Bamford. where the village dead lie safe and named on their own old stones under good dry grass. They remain in the memory room at the dam, and in the crew's names, and in the low salute of an aircraft over the twin towers on a summer afternoon. They remain in the walkers and the cyclists and the children with their bread, in the peace that the drowned valley pours out now over everyone who comes to it, exactly as it once poured out its water. And they remain, most of all, in the coming back, in the patient wall tops rising every dry summer out of the mud, to be touched and wondered at, and loved, and sinking again, and rising again, on and on down the long years, the village that will not quite be forgotten, because the land itself keeps bringing it up into the light to be remembered. This is the truth that the drowned valley leaves us with, and it is a gentle one, fit for the edge of sleep. That all things built up are in their long season laid down, the hall and the church and the humblest cottage alike, and that this is not a cruelty, but only the way of the world, the tide of it, the great slow rising and falling of the water over everything we make, and that even so, nothing truly remembered is ever truly gone. A place can be drowned and still be kept. A world can go under the water and still send its water out to bless the world above. And a thing may sleep for years beneath the still grey surface and lose none of itself in the sleeping, and rise again in its own good time, unchanged, into the light. Which is, when you think on it, a very hopeful thought to carry down into the dark. The valley is not afraid of the water. It has learned to sleep under it, and to wake from it, and to sleep again. And now, so may you. Are you still awake? It is quite all right if you are. You have come the whole long way down the valley with me, from the high moor and the pack-horse tracks, through the little living villages in their long afternoon, through the coming of the engineers and the patient dams and the tin town that built them, through the tender emptying and the careful lifting of the dead, through the slow blameless rising of the water and the young airmen droning overhead, through the falling of the church tower and the settling of the lake, and out at last into all these quiet years of keeping and remembering. It has been a long and gentle way, and you need not remember any of it. You need not remember the names, or the dates, or which reservoir came first, or where the bridge was carried to. Let all of that sink softly down beneath your own still surface, where it will keep perfectly well without you holding it. There is another video waiting for you there on the screen, another long, slow story, ready to carry you further down whenever you have need of it, and it will begin all on its own, so you need do nothing at all. If you have found any peace here tonight, and only if you truly have, you might let the channel know with a like, or you might subscribe, so that another sleepless soul on another dark night might find their way up this quiet valley and be eased as you have been eased. And if you have not yet done so, you might leave your own place and your own local time down in the comments. A soft word from wherever in the world you are lying now, so that we may all know how far this little valley has travelled and keep one another company in the dark. But all of that can wait for morning. There is nothing left now that you need to do, and nothing left that you need to hold. The lamp is low, the water is still, the valley is sleeping, and the villages are sleeping under it, safe and kept and remembered, and the rain will come when it comes, and the ruins will rise when they rise, and none of it needs your watching tonight. So let your shoulders come down one last time. Let the bed take all of your weight. Let the still grey water rise gently over the last of the day, and cover it, and hold it, and keep it. Close your eyes now. Good night and sweet dreams.